Hello, I'm Murray Walker, and this is my autobiography, unless I'm very much mistaken. Like everyone, I left my mother's womb without a very clear idea of what I wanted to do with my life. Yet here I am, nearly 80 years on, starting to write about it. Why? Well, all sorts of things motivate me, one of which is gratitude. I've been both lucky and privileged, having had a fabulous life full of richness. Basically because I like people, and there are usually plenty of them around whose company and friendship I can share. He's obsessed. If it hasn't got an engine, he's not interested, says my long-suffering wife Elizabeth. Now, this is not entirely true, but I do confess that the groaning bookshelves in my study don't have too many volumes of poetry. Talking of Elizabeth, you're not going to hear too much about her in this book. It's not that I don't love her dearly or respect and admire her, because I do, by the bucketful. It's just that Elizabeth's attitude is, he's public, I'm private. She's a tower of strength and has an infinitely better brain than me, but whereas I love the limelight, her idea of purgatory is to appear in public. She wouldn't welcome me banging on about her qualities here either, so I'm not going to do so. But I wouldn't have been able to do what I have done without her. I have to confess that I'm a workaholic. I'm absolutely useless at relaxing. I get irritated and restless. Throughout my life, I've had to be doing something, whether it's writing, researching my next race, going to it, talking about it, or travelling home eagerly to await the next one. I often wonder whether I would have been so passionately interested in motorsport had I not been brought up with it, or whether I would ever have picked up a microphone had my father not been as brilliant and gifted a commentator. It's impossible to tell, but I can't think of anyone I'd more aspire to be like than my father. After a long and distinguished motorcycle racing career, he became editor of the failing magazine Motorcycling. He turned it round by sheer ability, hard work and personality, and in 1935 the BBC asked him to do their radio commentaries for motorcycle events. He took to it like a duck to water. He made you feel as though you were there, with an infectious enthusiasm overlaid by total knowledge of his subject, and he was the BBC's top man on the sport for over 31 years. I was reasonably good at trials riding on my 500T Norton. I won a gold medal in the 1949 International Six Days Trial, but I decided that I was far more likely to get somewhere in business than by trying to set the world's racetracks alight. However, I was delighted when I got my first chance at broadcasting, albeit on a public address system. The Midlands Automobile Club asked me if I'd like to do the commentary on a combined car and bike meeting at their Shelsley-Walsh hill climb in Worcestershire. My father had been due to commentate for the BBC, but had to drop out at the last moment. The club asked him to recommend someone to take his place. "Why not try the boy?" he said. "I think he'll be all right. Even if he isn't, it won't be a disaster because he'll only be talking to the spectators, and they'll be able to see what's going on anyway." I suppose it was nepotism, but I certainly wasn't going to say no. And never mind the spectators, as far as I was concerned, I was talking to one man at Shelsley, Jim Pestridge, the BBC producer. There was no way he was going to miss me, for my voice was blasting out of a battery of loudspeakers right by his side. Now, the way you do a PA commentary and the way you do a radio commentary are quite different. With the former, there's no need to talk non-stop, as your role is more to give information and announcements than to commentate on the action, which the punters can see for themselves. The hell with that, I thought. For Jim's ears, I submitted the poor devils on the hill to a non-stop barrage of facts, figures, hysteria and opinion. Not much different there, then. And it worked. The next week, Geoffrey Peck, one of the BBC's senior sports producers, invited me to an audition to commentate at a Goodwood car meeting, and I got the job. One thing led to another. "We'd like you to do the second position, Stowe Corner, at Silverstone at the 1949 British Grand Prix," said Geoffrey after my successful Goodwood stint. Yes! I was on my way for what was to be a half-century-plus career, doing what I wanted to do. Travelling the world, going to wonderful places, working with stimulating people, satisfying my ego, and, moreover, being paid for it. For the next 13 years, in addition to my developing advertising career, I would be my dad's number 2, as the only long-term father and son sports commentary team the BBC has ever had. That was entirely to do with motorbikes, but I would also cover, for both BBC and ITV, anything to do with motorsport. Motorcycle trials, scrambles, and races of every type and class. Truck racing, powerboats, touring car racing, sports cars, rallycross, Formula Ford, Formula 3, Formula 3000, Formula 5000, and of course, the pinnacle of them all, Formula 1. It was here that I developed a reputation of being an enormously excitable chap who used colourful phrases, but didn't always get things right in his enthusiasm to communicate what he was seeing. Inevitably, people remember my amusing mistakes more than the factual comment. But importantly, they found them endearing, and that didn't do me any harm. Not so for others, though, given my entirely justified reputation for the Murray Walker kiss of death. I would confidently predict that something was going to happen, and dramatically, it wouldn't. At the 1986 Australian Grand Prix, Keke Rosberg asked me if he could have a word. "This is my last race, Murray. I'm retiring after it." "I know that, Keke. I've been talking about it for ages." "Well, this being my last race, I'm particularly anxious to do well in it." "Of course you are. Good luck to you, my friend." "Murray, if I am doing well, for Christ's sake, don't say anything about it." He was leading the race. I said he was going to win his last event, and he got a puncture and retired. A Williams success, Portugal 1990, was even more embarrassing. After a brilliant victory ahead of Senna and Prost, Nigel Mansell made his way to the interview room standing in the back of an open car, waving to the crowd, and hit his forehead on a steel beam. He staggered in and sat down as the cameras started rolling. "Nigel," I said, "first of all, will you carefully and slowly take your cap off? You've got an enormous bump on your head. Can you let them see it? Right up there." And stuck my finger right into the middle of it. It's a clip that never fails to raise a laugh. I hope my life story is even half as entertaining and rather less painful. My mother was the daughter of Harry Spratt, a well-to-do draper and gents outfitter who owned businesses in the market town of Leighton Buzzard, Bedfordshire. She had a pretty idyllic upbringing, a loving atmosphere in a fine home with servants, horses and stables, and she was an extremely attractive woman, very feminine and great fun. But she was also extremely bright, pragmatic and good with money, being a very nifty operator on the stock exchange. She created a wonderful home for me to grow up in, and I loved her dearly. Into her life in the 1920s came Sergeant Graham William Walker, dispatch rider, Royal Engineers, convalescing at Leighton Buzzard after having been injured in France in World War I by a German shell. The son of William Walker of Aberdeen, Company Secretary of the Union Castle Shipping Line, and his wife Jessie, this young, attractive man was potty about motorbikes. And it wasn't long before Graham and Elsie became man and wife. And the way these things happen, their marriage was followed by the arrival of 9 pounds 12 ounces Graham Murray Walker on the 10th of October 1923. I was born at home in Birmingham, for at that time my father was working there. So, like Nigel Mansell, I'm a Brummie, and proud of it. I worshipped my father, and I called him Daddy to his dying day when I was 33 years old. He was kind, generous, as honest as the day is long, a brilliant communicator, and an immensely hard worker, never deviating in his loyalty to his beloved wife and son. But he was a terrible worrier. My mother used to say, "Tim worries if he hasn't got something to worry about, because if he hasn't, there must be something wrong." Tim was her nickname for him. Don't ask me why. His passion was motorbikes, and he made an increasingly successful living through racing them and tuning them for others. And I grew up in a very comfortable atmosphere dominated by them. It was an unusual childhood. Where the fathers of other children were at home at the weekends, mine was forever disappearing to race on the continent, soon to reappear with some massive trophy, for he was very much one of the top men of his day. He wore himself out editing a motorcycle magazine and recruiting dispatch riders for the army in World War II, smoked too much, and died in 1962 when he was only 66. Conversely, my mother lived until she was a spirited 101. She lived in the New Forest fairly near us, and not long before she died I went to see her on one of my regular visits. "Hello, dear," she said, looking disapproving. "It's time you had your hair cut." "But I've hardly got any left, Mother." "Well, what you have got is too long." So what did I do? I had it cut. When I was born, my father was a works rider for the fabled Norton Motorcycle Company, and he won countless awards for them, including second place to the great Freddie Dixon in the 1923 Isle of Man Sidecar TT. In its day, the TT was more important than all the rest of the world's races put together, so this was quite a feat. In 1925, the Walker family moved to Wolverhampton, for my father had been made competitions manager for Sunbeam, the Rolls-Royce of motorcycles, as the company modestly described its products. More success led to another move in 1928, this time to Coventry and Rudge Whitworth, which has long since disappeared, but was one of the world's truly great motorcycle manufacturers at the time. And that was where my father really came good. Rudge, Norton and the rest of Britain's motorcycle manufacturers were in a head-to-head battle for sales, and racing success was vital. At Rudge Whitworth, my father was sales and competition director, and in 1928 came within an ace of winning what was then the most important race in the world, the Senior TT, retiring in the lead with only 14 of the 268 miles to go after a titanic scrap with the great Charlie Dodson. Just 2 months later, though, he got his revenge by becoming the first man to win a motorcycle Grand Prix at an average speed of over 80 miles an hour. It was the Ulster Grand Prix, and this time he beat Charlie by 11 seconds in a race where they were wheel to wheel for over 2.5 hours. With the sales office in London and the factory in Coventry, my father had constantly to commute from one to the other. So he said to my mother, "We can live in the Midlands or in the northern part of London. I don't mind, so it's your choice." Well, that was no contest for my mother, and off we went then to Enfield in Middlesex, which is where I spent most of my time from the age of 5 until I married at the ripe old age of 36. If my mother had an idyllic youth, then I most certainly did. A governess at home started my early education, followed by a couple of prep schools in the country before I went to my father's old public school at Highgate. One master there was the Reverend K.R.G. Hunt, who, on one occasion, got me out in front of the class to beat me, as they did in those days, for something trivial like putting adhesive on the board rubber. "I'm going to give you 3 strokes, Walker, but before I administer justice, have you got anything to say in mitigation?" "Yes, sir. I thought you'd be interested to know that I'll be the second generation of Walkers you've beaten, because you beat my father." "Oh, did I? Well, now I'm going to give you 6 for that." Which taught me to keep my mouth shut in difficult circumstances. But I really enjoyed school. I was no great scholar, but a steady grafter. I got school certificate with credits, and that's the equivalent of A-levels today, including, believe it or not, a distinction in divinity. At Highgate, I learnt to play the bugle in the school corps, became a prefect, mastered the intricacies of the intriguing wall game, fives, proudly won my first-class shot, with a .303 short model Lee Enfield World War I rifle that had a kick like a mule, and demonstrated a staggering lack of ability at soccer and cricket. Then came the phony war, and with it, evacuation to Westward Ho in glorious North Devon. And what a life it was. My schoolhouse was at the end of a superb beach, with Atlantic breakers crashing ashore just below my dormitory window. It was shorts and shirts the whole year round, weekend cycle rides to Clovelly and Appledore, swimming in the sea, sunbathing on the Pebble Ridge, and excitedly staring up at the Avro Ansons of Coastal Command as they lumbered across the blue skies in search of U-boats. I rose to the giddy height of Company Sergeant Major of the school corps, became captain of shooting, and even arrogance of arrogance, an instructor to the LDV. That's Local Defence Volunteers, the predecessors of the Home Guard or Dad's Army, many of whom had fought in World War I. I loved it. But then, at 18, it was time to go to war myself. Youth doesn't heed the horrors of war, and I was eager to go, but in one particular direction. I volunteered for tanks. I was accepted all right, but believe it or not, they said, "Sorry, Murray, you've got to wait. Not enough kit for you to train on. So fill in the time and we'll let you know when we're ready." What a frustrating setback. It's difficult to convey to today's generation how totally involved, intense and patriotically passionate everyone in Britain was about the war. Germany was regarded as the personification of evil. With the enemy literally at the door, Britain was fighting for its very survival, and I desperately wanted to be a part of it. However, at that time, the Dunlop Rubber Company, then one of Britain's greatest companies, awarded 12 scholarships a year, and I was fortunate to win one of them. Its scholarship students were based at its famous Fort Dunlop headquarters in Birmingham, and had tuition and fieldwork on all of its activities, as well as instruction from top people on every aspect of what makes a business tick, from production and distribution to marketing, law and accountancy. And it was invaluable grounding. I had a whale of a time, living in digs and discovering to my surprise and delight that girls had all sorts of charms I hadn't experienced at Highgate. But then came the call via a telegram. "We're ready for you now, Murray." My image of tank driving was racing across the desert, trailing great plumes of sand, having exciting leave in exotic Cairo, and being in my element with something mechanical. It was an ignorant and absolutely pathetic attitude. But on the 1st of October 1942, I reported for duty as number 144-06224 at the 30th Primary Training Wing at Bovington in Dorset. Bovington was, and is, the home of the Royal Armoured Corps, and the whole area seethed with tank activity. The 30th PTW was a huge culture shock for me. I found myself amongst all sorts of people that I'd never come across before. In the bunk on one side of me in the barracks room was an incredibly upmarket chap whose name I've genuinely forgotten, and whose general uselessness was well nigh unbelievable. On the other side was a laconically lovely bloke called Ted Nicklin, a welder from Walsall, as streetwise as they come. Living as part of such a disparate mix did me all the good in the world, because it taught me there were other points of view, other ways to speak, and more ways than one to skin a cat. Eventually, though, as the result of much marching, cleaning, running, jumping, parading, sentry-going, weapons inspecting, church parading and general hammering into shape, I was ready to move onwards and upwards to Stanley Barracks as a very proud trooper to the 58th Training Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps. Still at Bovington, but life was at a higher level and altogether more specialised, with 6 months of driving, gunnery, wireless and crew commanding instruction. I will never forget the first time I drove a tank. It was a 20-ton Crusader, and I can still feel the thrill as I hunkered down into the driver's compartment with its 340 horsepower 12-cylinder Liberty engine thundering away behind me. Rev it like mad, clutch up, and go! With the crash gearbox in top, it could do 40 miles an hour in the right conditions, and believe me, that felt more like 400 miles an hour. In the Crusader, you steered by pulling two metal bars which braked the appropriate track and made the tank turn one way or the other. You felt invincible as the whole thing noisily bucked and plunged, ripped and roared its way ahead. Magic! I completed my training with the 58th successfully enough to be selected for my War Office Selection Board and appeared before it. I made the grade, and to my unbounded pride and joy, was told to report as an officer cadet to number 512 Troop Pre-Octu, Officer Cadet Training Unit, at Blackdown. Yes, yes, yes! Then, in October 1943, it was goodbye to Pre-Octu and hello to 115 Troop RAC Octu at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the most famous and historic in the world. I was immensely proud to be there. Sandhurst was enormously enjoyable, but it was also tough, with major emphasis on determination, initiative and leadership. Some 23 of us started in 115 Troop, and 6 months later, 18 of us reached the giddy heights of second lieutenant. Passing out day was on the 8th of April 1944, with all the moving pomp and circumstance at which the army is so accomplished. My parents and friends were there, and the salute was to be taken by that great American, General Dwight Eisenhower, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Allied Forces, and later President of the United States of America. In just 2 months' time, those forces would be landing on the coast of Europe to commence its bloody liberation. On to that magnificent parade ground in front of the old college, then, marched the entire Sandhurst contingent in proud formation. Even 57 years on, I can still feel the excitement and pride. I was now Second Lieutenant Walker, Royal Armoured Corps, wearing the coveted blackberry and ready to go to war. I was very lucky to join the Royal Scots Greys. I was and still am immensely proud to have been a Greys officer and to have fought with them. The regiment had fought with great distinction in Palestine and in General Montgomery's magnificent 8th Army, from the Western Desert to Tripoli. It had taken part in the invasion of Italy, landed in Normandy, fought its way through France, into and out of Belgium, and was now at Nederweert in Holland, where I joined it. When I reported to the tent of the charming Major Sir Anthony Bonham, he said to me, "Welcome to the regiment. We're glad to have you with us. You'll be responsible to Sergeant Macpherson." Sergeant, I thought. What the hell does he think this second lieutenant's pip on my shoulder is? Confetti? "I know what you're thinking," he said. "Fresh out of Sandhurst, I expect you think you're God's gift to the British Army. But you should know that Macpherson's been with us since Palestine. He's forgotten more about fighting and the way the regiment does it than you'll ever know. And when he says you're capable of commanding a troop, you'll have one." He was, of course, absolutely right. So I watched and listened, and before long, I got my own troop. A few days later, we moved to the island between the Waal and Niederrhein rivers north of Nijmegen, where I had my first experience of sentry-go, Greys style. Up all night, standing in the Sherman's turret, with the Germans on the other side of the river, thinking that every sound you heard was one of them creeping up to blast you to perdition with a Panzerfaust. This was shortly after the airborne forces' attempt to capture the bridge over the River Maas at Arnhem, and from our positions on the other side of the river, we could see, hanging from the trees, parachutes and supply containers for the beleaguered airborne troops. By the end of that winter of 1945, the war had surged up to the very borders of Germany, and the Greys were heavily involved in some of the bloodiest fighting of the Second Front. The going was very tough indeed, with the Germans resisting every inch of the way, with anti-tank guns, rivers, ditches, snipers, blown bridges, Panzerfausts. Their homeland was now being directly threatened, and that added extra steel to their resistance. Life was a non-stop series of encounters, and it was here that I had one of the most emotional experiences of my life. Times arose when we had to let other units leapfrog through our positions so that we could refuel, take on fresh ammunition, and eat. Sitting on the turret with my legs dangling inside while my troop was on its way to one of these tank pit stops, I saw a group of 4 men in army uniform, and idly thought that one chap looked just like my father. As we got closer, I realised to my amazement that it was my father. At the time, he was editor of motorcycling and had got himself accredited as a war correspondent with the express intention of finding me. Needless to say, it was wonderful to see him, but there wasn't time for more than a short conversation because I had to get back into action. With V-1 rockets aimed at Antwerp soaring over us, we advanced despite the most stubborn resistance by panzers and elite paratroops, and on the 24th of February 1945 we crossed the border into Germany. You know, it's difficult to find the words to express my emotions as I saw the crudely written signboard saying, "You are now entering Germany." Since 1939, Britain had been subjected to defeat after defeat. Our cities had been bombed. Countless thousands of men and women had been killed, maimed and injured, and Hitler's U-boats had done their best to starve us out. Britain had been on its knees, but it had fought back, and now, with the might of America at its side, it was winning. On the 25th of March, we crossed the Rhine. German forces were still holding out in Holland to our left and the Ruhr to our right, but between them, the way was now open for a charge to the River Elbe and Hamburg. After virtually continuous fighting, we crossed the crucial River Elbe south of Hamburg, and now our momentum was unstoppable, with the Russians advancing rapidly towards Berlin from the east and the combined forces of the west pushing forward from the other direction. The Germans were in a vice and their resistance melted. With bitter memories of the Russian campaign uppermost in their minds, the last thing they wanted was to be captured by Stalin's men, merciless and eager for retribution. And it was vital to the Allies that their forces reached the Baltic before the Russians. The key was Lübeck. "Get to Lübeck first," was the order given by the War Office to the 21st Army Group. The Greys and the 6th Airborne Division were instructed to head for Wismar on the Baltic coast, and we went for it. It was an incredible experience. At the rate of some 5,000 troops an hour, the German army was heading west as fast as possible to avoid being captured by the Russians, while on the same single carriageway road we were hammering east, absolutely flat out. With the British and Germans going their different ways just feet away from each other, there was no fighting, no acknowledgement even. At one point, our headlong gallop was brought to a halt by the sheer weight of traffic. And sitting on top of the turret eating a tin of Spam, I found myself looking down onto a vast open Mercedes-Benz staff car containing 4 high-ranking officers. We studied each other dispassionately, and not a word was spoken. Then the column moved on. So did they, and that was the last we saw of each other. On the 2nd of May 1945, after an incredible 80-mile dash in one day, the Royal Scots Greys reached Wismar to become the first unit of the British Army to link up with the Russians, in the form of a captured German BMW motorcycle and sidecar carrying an officer on the pillion and a woman soldier in the sidecar, accompanied by a couple of American scout cars and another mixed bunch of soldiery. The war was over. At 24, on the back of my Dunlop scholarship, I landed the job of assistant to C.L. Smith, the advertising manager of the company's major division, the Tyre Group at Fort Dunlop. So it was off to digs in Birmingham. It was the first time I'd been on my own, free from school or army discipline and completely my own master. I had a girlfriend, and I used to go by tram to Snow Hill to see her. The route took in Aston Cross, where there was the Mitchell and Butler's brewery, the H.P. sauce factory, and a tannery. On a hot summer's evening, the smell was absolutely indescribable. I often visited the Birmingham Motorcycle Club to meet people like the famous BSA competitions boss Bert Perigo, one of the all-time greats of motorcycle trials riding, Jeff Smith and Brian Martin, trials and scramble stars of the day, and the amazing Olga Kevalos, who ran a cafe near Snow Hill Station with her Greek father, but was far more interested in being Britain's leading female trials rider. At this time, the legendary Jeff Duke, one of the greatest motorcycle racers of all time, was making a name for himself. Firstly, as a works trials rider, and then in 1949 by winning the Senior Manx Grand Prix on his first appearance. We used to meet and gossip in the Norton Competitions Department in Bracebridge Street, where Jeff worked. Another of my Birmingham friends was the legendary Ulsterman Rex McCandless, who had designed a spring frame for his grass-tracking brother, Crummy, which was blowing the socks off everything in Irish racing. Rex joined Norton as a consultant, and the all-conquering Norton Featherbed racing frame came into being. It was while I was in Birmingham that my own short-lived motorcycle competition career began, but I was no more than a fairly competent club-standard rider, and I singularly failed to hit the big time. And then came the thing that changed my life, that invitation to do the PA commentary at Shelsley Walsh. From then on, I led a double life, which became increasingly demanding as the years rolled by. My business life occupied the weekdays, and very often the weekends, while my broadcasting hobby absorbed every other waking moment. But although I had been promoted to Dunlop's HQ in London and was hobnobbing with the directors and the divisional top bananas, the job itself was too boring for words. "How about joining the Allied Group advertising department?" said its boss, Stuart James. Done! The Allied Group comprised everything except tyres, and I became advertising manager for Dunlopillo Foam Cushioning, the General Rubber Goods Division, and the Special Products Division. Much better. Now I had something involving and interesting to do, like supervising all the company's publicity for its Dunlopillo installations at the 1951 Festival of Britain and the rebuilt House of Commons. I have sat in the Speaker's chair. I loved the job, but I realised that if I was going to make any money and achieve anything worthwhile, I ought to be stirring myself to find one with better long-term prospects. I'd been with Dunlop for some 7 years by then, and I'd got itchy feet. My friend Terry Thompson was working as a copywriter at the aspiring London advertising agency, Macius and Ferguson. "You can write," he said, "so why don't I get you a job interview here?" And he did. But, to my surprise, when I landed the job, it wasn't with Macius, but with Aspro, the headache pill company at Slough. Aspro were looking for a copywriter for their own creative department and had asked their 3 advertising agencies to help them find the right man. I resolved to give it a go, creating the demand for and selling, by the million, a fast-moving, low-cost product that called for aggressive and hard-hitting advertising. It seemed another world from those expensive mattresses, rubber buckets, conveyor belting and universal joints. But they offered me £1,000 a year. I'd made it. Not long after I joined Aspro came a memorable meeting with Chairman John Jamieson. One of the vast geographical areas I was responsible for was India, Pakistan, and what was then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. One day the chairman called me in and said, "You're responsible for India, Murray?" "Yes, sir." "Have you been there?" "No, I haven't." "How can you do the advertising if you've never been there?" I don't make the rules, Mr. Jamison. I just do the best I can. Well, you'd better go. Yes, sir. When? Next week. Soon I was on the plane, heading for some of the most memorable and stimulating weeks of my life. On the 2nd of November 1954, my magical mystery tour began at Bombay Central Station, starting with the long haul to Delhi. I spent the majority of my time in the villages, because that was where the vast majority of India's inhabitants lived, and because Aspro was one of the few modern all-purpose medicines they could afford. Take Aspro for headaches, colds, flu, rheumatism, and all your aches and pains. It's the wonder cure, we claimed. And it was true, for acetylsalicylic acid, which is aspirin, which is what Aspro was, is a vastly underrated product. Sadly, it doesn't increase sexual power, which is what a lot of folks in India believed it did. Communication was the problem when it came to promoting Aspro. Newspapers were limited, there were no cinemas in the villages, and no television, while commercial radio was booked solid. So we had Aspro information units, loudspeaker vans that toured the villages, broadcasting the advantages and benefits of Aspro and distributing samples. Now, visiting India is an assault on the senses. The heat, wall-to-wall people, thrusting, jostling and shouting, vibrant colours, bright sunshine, non-stop deafening music, sacred cows wandering along in the streets, horns blowing, spice-laden smells and a terrific sense of vitality and overcrowding. Hot, noisy, smelly and congested chaos. And then there was the curry. Real curry. And very different from that I'd had at school. Our first stop was at Jaipur, a place that really impressed me. The pièce de résistance was the Maharaja's personal white temple to the god Vishnu, with solid silver doors and panels of awe-inspiring mythological scenes. Then to Delhi and Cawnpore on the holy river Ganges, and an incredible religious festival, with thousands of people completely immersing themselves in the holy waters of the river, drinking them, washing in them, and bottling them to take away. Fakirs lying on barbed wire or with pins through their noses and flesh. Dying and horribly diseased people. All human life was there to pay homage. It may seem hard to believe, but I was actually working while all this spellbinding tourism was going on. Finding out what people thought about Aspro, talking to the merchants, evolving media schedules, booking radio time and newspaper space, writing advertisement copy and radio commercials, getting layouts done, commissioning artwork, producing brochures, and touring local shops and bazaars. By Calcutta I was ready for a bit of a rest, but it was not to be. On to Nagpur and Bangalore, and then to Mysore. Its Durbar halls were staggering, with a solid gold ceremonial elephant which weighed 3,200 pounds and was more valuable than the economies of many of the countries around it, no doubt. But although I was enjoying every second of the trip, I was now learning nothing new. The reactions I was getting were exactly the same wherever I was. So, on to Ceylon. The reactions weren't any different there, but it was a fabulous experience. Which is more than I can say for Chittagong in East Pakistan, with the possible exception of Mexico City, quite the worst place I've ever visited. Dirty, smelly, chaotic, and generally repulsive. Soon, though, it was time for another flight, over the top of India to Karachi. But when I got to Karachi, I found a cable that read, "Enough is enough. Come home. Jamison." After 14 weeks away, I'd been rumbled. I got back to Slough at the end of January 1955, wrote a massive report on everything that had happened to me, made sweeping recommendations, and sat back to await developments. About 2 weeks after I'd got back, there was an invitation from the chairman, John Jamison himself. "Have a good trip, Murray." "Yes, indeed, sir." "Think you know all about India now?" "Well, no, but I know a lot more than I did before I went." "Enough to do the advertising?" Oh yes, definitely. Well, that's too bad, because now we're going to put you in charge of home market media. All that work, all that travelling was going totally to waste. But that job didn't last very long either, as I was soon promoted to advertising manager of the Aspro Home Products division, responsible to the marketing director Tom Peters, a tough and confident Australian who was great fun to work for. Aspro had bought several companies to diversify from the analgesic business, which coined money but was vulnerable to attack from rivals like Airton. And what a ragbag they were. Lifeguard disinfectant, kills all known household germs, dip plastic starch, and easy-to-use stiffener for the voluminous knee-high skirts which were then so fashionable and so attractively made women look like women. Dispel air freshener, just lift the whip to fill your house with glorious fragrance. And Shirley's proprietary pet products. None of them had much of an advertising budget, but one of my 3 advertising agencies was Macias & Ferguson. It was at this time that I really took a shine to Macias, with which I was eventually to spend 23 very happy and successful years. Tom Peters got a message one day to go and see the boss, Bill Lloyd. A few minutes later, he was out of the door, and I wasn't very far behind him. McCann Erickson, the world's largest advertising agency, had made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Apart from my work with Aspro, I was now some 8 years into my broadcasting career and becoming well known for my motorsport activities. Peter Lowther, then boss of McCann's, reckoned I'd fit in very well on an automotive account, and doubled my salary to £2,000 a year. I was back in the motor world, but this time trying to generate demand for motor oil, a product with as little interest for motorists as tyres. McCann handled the mighty Standard Oil business worldwide, with Esso Extra Petrol being the lead product. This alone made a lot of the agency's money, and Jack Taylor and I, the account executives, would stagger down to the Esso advertising manager with not one but 15 campaign approaches in the hope that one of them would ring the bell. "Why don't you show me the one at the bottom?" he'd say. "That's the one you want to sell me, isn't it?" Catchy, memorable advertising was the name of the day. For petrol, the Esso sign means happy motoring television commercials with their singing cartoon petrol pump globes and bouncy jingle worked a treat. But Esso Extra Motor Oil was something else. Oil, like tyres, is a necessary evil. No one says, "Hey, come and see the stunning new Dunlop tyres on my car," or "Wow, I feel $1 million now my car's filled with Esso Extra Motor Oil." Or if they do, they need their brain testing. It was hard going. I was at McCann's for 2 years, but I felt I had to move on. And on impulse, I phoned Jack Wynne-Williams at Macias. He invited me over, and sitting in his cosy office overlooking St. James's Square, we did the deal that was to take me to the end of my business life. My new clients at Macias, the Mars confectionery and pet foods companies, were wholly owned by Forrest Mars, an American who didn't think or act like other people. He was a one-off maverick, and even his own father, Frank Mars, who owned a hugely successful confectionery business in America, found him too much to stomach. Legend has it that he gave his son $30,000, a massive amount of money in those days, plus the rights to use the recipe for the Mars bar, named after the owner and not the planet, anywhere outside America, and told him to germinate your ass to the other side of the Atlantic. Forrest set up shop in Slough in 1932 and started his business with the Mars bar, which is still very much one of Britain's leading brands. Mike Macias would go down to Slough every Saturday for Mr. Mars to tell him how much money he could have for advertising the next week. "Mars are marvellous," was the rather plonking claim, but under Forrest's distinctive and forceful leadership, the business became one of the most successful the world has ever seen. It began with the Mars bar, led to other brands like Milky Way, Maltesers, Bounty, Galaxy, Spangles and Opal Fruits, and then to the start of an entirely new and innovatory product, canned pet foods. In those days, British pets were fed household scraps, and the marketing objective was to persuade the owners to substitute canned pet foods products. This wasn't easy when the household scraps cost nothing and Pal, Lassie, Kitty Cat and the rest had to be paid for. Nor was it easy to get a doubting trade to stock them, when it was generally believed the contents were mainly factory floor sweepings. I used to make shop calls with pet food sales reps, and we would solemnly open a can of Kitty Cat before their cynical eyes and eat some to show how good and wholesome it was. That usually won them over, and so it should have, for at the time it was mostly whale meat, which most of us ate during the war with no ill effects. Eventually we won the day, for who feeds their pets household scraps these days? One of my brands was Trill, the budgerigar seed, and on a visit to Melton Mowbray, I was presented with a unique problem by Tom Johnstone, the Pet Foods Marketing Director. With Trill, we have over 90% of the packaged budgerigar seed market, and we very much want to expand what is an extremely profitable business, he said. Yes, Tom, of course. In a static market, the obvious thing to do is to buy our competitors, but we don't want to do that, because if we did, we could well run foul of the Monopolies Commission. Yes, of course, Tom. So what we have to do is to increase the budgerigar population, and then we'll get 90% of the extra business. Yes, of course. Smart thinking, Tom. So that's what we want you to do, Murray. Come up with ideas of how we can do it. You what? Off you go then, and we'd like your proposals within a week with full advertising and budgetary recommendations. Back I went to the agency, outlined the brief, and sat back to worry. 2 days later, we were all back together. Here's the deal, Murray. Most people have just the one budgie, right? Right. Well, what we want to do is to create a guilt complex by promoting the belief that an only budgie is a lonely budgie, and thus motivating their owners to go out and buy another one. You what? You heard, Murray. Think about it. Well, the more I thought about it, the more I liked it. It made sense even if I wasn't too sure about whether sole budgies pined for company and what effect multiple budgies would have on their owners. So we worked up a pool of commercials, publicity material and costing, and back I went to Melton where I made a sale. Macius was a wonderful place to work, and as the Mars Empire grew, so did ours, for they gave us their business in the new countries they entered, and so Macius opened offices in the major European countries, initially to handle Mars and Colgate brands, but which we could use as bases to pitch for other business. Later, we added America, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, and I was eventually to be visiting most of the Macius agencies outside the UK regularly as my responsibilities increased. Then, in 1964, 5 eventful years after I joined the agency, Jack Wynne-Williams made me a proposition. I'm going to give you a chance to put your money where your mouth is by offering you an opportunity to buy into the agency. It'll cost you £30,000, and Warburg, the agency's bankers, will lend you the money with an annual interest payment of 10%. That was very reasonable at the time. You'll have to sell the shares when you retire or leave the agency, but in the meantime, if we continue to do as well as we have in the past, the dividends will cover the interest, and in time the share value growth should more than enable you to repay the loan with a sizable profit. But of course there's no guarantee, so it's up to you. Think it over and let me know. £30,000 then was the equivalent of not far off £500,000 now, and putting myself in debt to that extent was not something that appealed to me. On the other hand, the whole of life is a gamble, and I was never going to have another opportunity like this. I talked it over with Elizabeth, and the next morning I went back to Jack and said I was on. He told me I'd made a wise decision and he was sure I wouldn't regret it. I certainly didn't. From then on, there were other occasional share offers as directors retired and sold up, and I bought every one I was offered. My faith and good luck paid off, because everything that Jack had prophesied came to pass. I certainly never made a better financial decision. End of side 1. Before very much longer, I became a theoretical prospect for managing director, but for very good reasons, that was where my agency progress ended. One was that my double life as an agency executive and an increasingly busy broadcaster meant that I'd have to give up the latter and devote all my time to the business, and there was no way that that was going to happen. I liked my other life too much. I had a very happy life, a happy marriage, a fine home, and a broadcasting hobby where I was making consistent progress, and which could go on for long after I'd retired from the business. Things were going very well for me, and as it happened, I was about to make a massive change of direction in my agency life. Up until now, Macius had a foot in all sorts of major product fields, but there were several missing from its portfolio. Most notably the car business, which was clearly going to get bigger. So, when Vauxhall Cars invited the agency to have a look at its business, a shiver of excitement went through the building. "I want you to look after this one, Murray," said Jack, and I didn't need a second invitation. We put together a team of the agency's best and went at it absolutely flat out. And it was good news. We were in. Euphoria all round. But it wasn't easy to do well for Vauxhall, for their cars were seen as dull and Americanised rust buckets. The Viscount was the top model. It had everything. Plenty of smooth power, automatic gearbox, power brakes and power steering, electric windows, leather upholstery, multi-band radio, the lot. You may get all these things in virtually any car now, but you didn't then. And the Viscount oozed along with effortless smoothness, but absolutely zilch in the way of automotive charisma. Elizabeth loved it for its luxury and lack of drama, but it didn't suit my gung-ho self-image at all. I felt 40 years older every time I got in it. Meantime, almost every weekend was either the BBC's or ITV's. On Friday evening, I'd leave the office in St James's Square, meet Elizabeth and our boxer dog, Sheba, and head off in the car to wherever that weekend's Scramble was taking place, usually somewhere in the Midlands or the North. And in those days there was no M1 motorway. So it was a long slog up the A5 and onwards to arrive at an hotel late at night, and then be on parade at the track first thing on Saturday. If it was ITV's World of Sport, with Dickie Davis hosting the programme from London, all the races were repeated for the regional network the next day at the same track, with the same riders on the same bikes. Then it was home again, starting at about 5 p.m. if we were lucky, for another long drive and into the office on Monday morning. Which is why, in the winter of 1963, I wrote most of my book, The Art of Motorcycle Racing, which I co-authored with the great Mike Halewood, by the light of a flexible reading lamp in the passenger seat of our Austin A40 with Elizabeth at the wheel. By 1982, I only had some 6 months to go before I was 60, and would have to retire. I wanted to move on from Macius and develop my broadcasting career, so I went to see my friend Dave Lee, who now occupied Jack Wynne Williams' position. "I'm off, Dave," I said. Dave understood, and Macius gave me a wonderful send-off and my full pension. I sold my shares for rather more than I'd paid for them, and without regret set off into the sunset to start my new life as a freelance. I know well enough how I started commentating, but for the life of me I can't remember why. It's not the sort of thing you just drift into, and I certainly don't remember feeling that my life was going to be incomplete until I had a microphone in my hands. But the urge must have been there, or I wouldn't have leapt at the Shelsley Walsh opportunity, or been so eager to take up the BBC's subsequent offer of an audition at Goodwood. The audition went well, and before I knew it, I was in the elevated rabbit hutch of a commentary box at Silverstone, Stowe Corner, at the British Grand Prix on May the 14th, 1949, as number 2 to Max Robertson. It wasn't Formula One then, for that didn't begin until 1950, and it was radio, not television, but television coverage of sport was in its infancy. Although my first TV commentary, on a motorcycle hill climb at Nats Valley in Kent, was also as early as 1949. Switzerland's Baron Thulo de Graffenried won the race in a Maserati CLT, and I had my first unnerving wake-up call when John Bolster lost his ERA in a big way, came barrelling down the hangar straight end over end, and deposited himself in a bleeding mess at the foot of my box. Blimey, I thought, they didn't tell me what to say about something like this. And accurately but understatedly I said, "Bolster's gone off!" I thought he was dead, but he recovered, later to become the BBC's outspoken car racing pit lane commentator. I must have rung some sort of a bell at the Beeb, because only 12 days later I was in the Isle of Man to commentate from the TT grandstand on the British Racing Drivers Club's Empire Trophy and Manx Cup car races. A youngster called Sterling Moss was sensational, creating a record lap and leading by a country mile in his 998cc Cooper Jap until it broke down. Only a week or so after the BRDC meeting, BBC radio producer Geoffrey Peck contacted me again. "We liked your stuff on the British Grand Prix and the Empire Trophy. We need an extra chap in the Isle of Man for the TT motorcycle races. Can you help us out? We know they're very different from the cars you've done well, but would you like to have a go at them as part of your father's team?" Motorbikes were and still are very much my first love, so I didn't hesitate. I don't know how I got the time off from Dunlop, but it was back again in early June to Mona's Isle and the Castle Mona Hotel on Douglas Promenade, where I'd stayed so many times in my youth, for the first of some 26 years of magical visits. I loved the place, and TT Week had a charisma and atmosphere like no other motorsport meeting in the world. The Isle of Man is only about 30 miles long by 10 miles wide, but it has some stunning scenery, excellent roads, and its 37.73-mile TT circuit is unique. All public highway that's closed for the races, it twists and turns, rises and falls, climbs up and over 1,400-foot Snaefell, includes superb flat-out sections that are miles long, and is the supreme challenge for motorcycle racing. From 1907 to 1976, the best in the world raced there, and it's still an unequalled motorcycle racing festival, although no longer part of the World Championships. When I rode my motorbikes endlessly round the TT circuit to learn the course, I used to revel in the fact that I was flying along the same road on which heroes like Alec Bennett, Jimmy Guthrie, Stanley Woods, my father, and so many others had raced. So I was awestruck when I took up station at my 1949 commentary point for the 350cc Junior TT at the Ballacrane right-hander, 7.5 miles from the start at Douglas. My father was at the grandstand on the Glen Crutchery Road, overlooking the enormous scoreboard, the refuelling pits, and Douglas Cemetery. Alan Clark was at Kirkmichael Village, 14 miles out, where they blast through the narrow streets absolutely flat out. Richard North was at Ramsey, 9 miles further on, and just before the start of the mountain climb. And Alan Dixon was at Craignabar, the 35-mile point. There was no commentary box for me, though. I just stood in the middle of the escape road, clutching my clipboard, festooned with wires, harness and headphones, and with microphone at the ready, eager to give it plenty. When Les Graham arrived at thunderbolt velocity on his Work 7R AJS and overshot the corner, he very nearly disemboweled me with his clutch lever. But it was a great day. If you were a motorcycle racing freak like me, the TT was pure magic. You got up at 4 a.m. on practice days, went to the paddock, drank hot cocoa in the Cadbury tent and talked to the riders. Watched them start one at a time as soon as it was light enough, and then rode off through the side roads to see them in action. It was spine-chilling to stand at the bottom of Bray Hill or Bagarrow as they hurtled by in a blur of concentrated noise and action. To hear them approach and then blast past you, flat out along the long Sulby Straight. To watch them sweep round the double left-hander on the mountain at the 33rd milestone, on their way to plummet from Kate's Cottage towards Cregner Bar. Then there were the social functions, the horse trams on the promenade, walking round Douglas to chat with the teams while they prepared their bikes, and the euphoric atmosphere of the prize-giving at the open-air Villa Marina. In Douglas the weather always seemed to be brilliant, and if there was a lull, there was the lure of the circuit itself, inviting you to blast round its unrestricted roads. They were wonderful times. Unless I'm very much mistaken, I commentated on some 188 TTs, plus at least 50 Manx Grand Prix, and I wouldn't have missed a second of any of them. If I live to be 100, I shall never forget the sheer nerve-shattering noise of Bob McIntyre's four-cylinder Gilera and John Surtees MV4 in first and second places on the last lap of the 1957 Senior TT as they wailed their way up through the gears towards Brandish Corner. "Just listen to this," I said, and stopped talking. Words were superfluous. That was the historic race in which the great Bob McIntyre became the first man to lap the island at over 100 miles an hour. It's not unfair to say that of the 5 commentators, only my father and I were knowledgeable and enthusiastic about the sport. One of the others was the suave and immaculate David Southwood, a BBC presenter whose speciality was a film review programme called A Seat in the Circle. David commentated from Cregner Bar, and one year my father said from the grandstand, "And now race leader Jeff Duke is due at Cregner Bar within seconds, so over to David Southwood." Perfect timing, Graham. As I look up the hill, I can see Jeff crouched over the tank of his Norton, hurtling round the bend at Kate's Cottage, racing down towards me, and now I can see the sun glinting on his famous helmet. Oh, it's a seagull. Thank you, David. We'll let you know. The 1950s and 60s were the TT's post-war golden years. At their beginning, the British Nortons, Velocets and AJSs were supreme in the larger capacity classes. British prestige was high, and as a result, British motorcycle sales boomed. All was not well, however. Continental manufacturers like MV, Mondial, Benelli, NSU and MZ had dominated the 125 and 250cc categories since the races had recommenced after the war. But then, from 1952, the advanced four-cylinder bikes of Gilera and MV blew away the old-fashioned British singles to gain supremacy in the 350 and 500cc classes. The coup de grace for the British industry came when a Honda fact-finding mission arrived from Japan in 1958. No one had ever heard of Honda, and although the war had been over for some time, the Japanese were far from popular. However, when they appeared in Douglas, studiously photographing everything in sight, engines and gearboxes, frames and forks, brakes, tanks, the lot, there were those of us who thought it was time to turn the other cheek. Speaking slowly and loudly, the time-honoured British conversational approach to foreigners, the discussion would go something like this. "Where are you from?" "We're from Honda Motor Company." "Honda Motor Company?" "Oh, yes. And what do you do?" "Make motorcycles." "Aha! And why are you here?" "Next year we race TT." "Oh, with the Kamikaze Special, I suppose. And will Harry Kari be riding for you? First to the bottom of Bray Hill, the winner?" Very funny, we thought. And with Japan's image as a nation of copyists, we expected them to return with rather inferior replica Nortons. But when Honda turned up in 1959 with beautifully engineered 4-valve, double overhead camshaft, twin-cylinder 125s, we stopped smirking, especially when they won the team prize first time out. The next year they came back with 4-cylinder 250s, which turned over at 16,000 revs a minute, and on his Honda debut in 1961, Mike Hailwood won both the 125cc and 250cc races for them, as well as a record third TT win in 1 week on a 500cc Norton. Honda was followed by Suzuki, Yamaha and Kawasaki, and soon Japan ruled the racing roost, as it still does today. The TT lost favour because the Continental riders were unhappy that it took time to learn the uniquely long and demanding mountain circuit. They also regarded it as excessively dangerous, and its demands rapidly wore out delicate two-stroke engines. What's more, they had to spend 2 weeks in the Isle of Man. In that fortnight, they could ride in 2 far shorter Continental meetings, wear out their bikes less, and earn far more money. When even British stars like Barry Sheene and Phil Reed shunned the TT, its World Championship status was lost, and these days it's no more than a glorified national meeting. It's very sad, but I suppose inevitable. I console myself with the knowledge that I saw the best of its stars when they were at their prime. And my top 10 solo riders of my TT years were, in no particular order, Mike Hailwood, Jeff Duke, Giacomo Agostini, John Surtees, Bob McIntyre, Jim Redman, Phil Reed, Carlo Ubbiali, Luigi Taveri and Tarquinio Pravini. Any selection is bound to be controversial, and I don't expect mine to be any different. So, apart from saying that, in my opinion, Mike Hailwood was the greatest of all time, I'm not going to try and argue a logical case for my choice. I had a very close involvement with Mike for many years. I was at Alton Park on the 27th of April 1957 for the 17-year-old's first race, when he rode craggy Bill Webster's MV to 7th place in the 125cc event. I watched, marvelled and commentated on his meteoric rise to stardom, in which, in only his second year of racing, he won 3 of the 4 British Championships in 1958, and then, the following year, the whole lot. His first TT win in 1961, and his first of 9 World Championships the same year. I commentated on every one of his 12 TT victories for Norton, Honda and MV, as well as countless short-circuit wins, until his first retirement from motorcycle racing in 1967. Mike was a natural-born genius in the saddle, a hell-raiser out of it, a modest and easy-going man completely free of pretentiousness and great fun to be with. He was very much my hero, and he always will be. 11 years into his retirement, he made an amazing comeback to win 2 more TTs in 1978 and 79, only to be killed less than 2 years later in a road crash for which he was totally blameless. I will always remember him with great warmth and affection, and not only for his uncanny skill as a rider, or being the man who won the 1967 Senior TT, the most exciting race I have ever seen. Just consider the scenario. There was the 27-year-old Mike Hailwood, master of the Isle of Man and a racing phenomenon, and his great Italian rival, Giacomo Agostini, whose swarthy, film-star looks, cheerful personality and riding brilliance made him almost as popular as Mike with the crowds. This was to be Hailwood's last event on the magical island before retiring, when Honda withdrew from racing at the end of the year. He had won 11 TTs, including that Wednesday's 350cc event, at record speed and with an incredible record lap faster than the 500cc record, and 5 of the last 6 senior events. And this despite the indifferent handling of the ferociously powerful Honda. Agostini was the reigning 500cc world champion on the three-cylinder MV, which ironically had been developed by Hailwood in his years of unparalleled success with the Italian concern. The MV was as quick as the Honda, but it handled immeasurably better, and Aggo was very nearly the equal of Hailwood. It was his 25th birthday, and a victory over Mike on the Masters' home ground would be the best possible present he could give himself. I was at the nerve centre of the BBC's coverage of the TT, the main commentary box at the grandstand, looking down at the starting grid in ideal weather, as in rather tatty old leathers, Hailwood, number 4, bump-started his Honda into life and blasted off down steep Bray Hill at enormous velocity, followed 30 seconds later by number 9, Agostini. The other 37 competitors might not have existed for all the attention they got. It was all focused on the two superstars. When Aggo raced past the grandstand flat on the tank at the end of lap 1 and disappeared from view down Bray Hill, he was a sensational 11.8 seconds ahead of Hailwood on corrected time, with a searing new lap record of 108.38 miles an hour from a standing start. Wrestling with the unruly Honda, Hailwood speeded up on lap 2 to close the gap to 8.6 seconds, with another lap record of 108.7 miles an hour, which was to stand for 8 years. But then the tension became almost unbearable as they each came in for their refuelling stops at the end of lap 3, half distance. Hailwood stopped first, and he was now a mere 2 seconds behind Aggo on corrected time. The stop was going to be crucial. The frenzied crowd shouted, "Mike, Mike, Mike!" and "Aggo, Aggo, Aggo!" But Hailwood was in trouble. The twist grip on his right handlebar, which controlled the power, had worked loose. Never an engineer, he yelled to his crew for a hammer and pounded away at it, with me incandescent with excitement in the commentary box above him. But when he finally heaved the unwieldy machine into life, it looked as though he was defeated. His stop, 48 seconds to Agostini's 37, meant that he was now 10 seconds behind the Italian with 3 laps to go. At the start of the 5th lap, Aggo led by 11.6 seconds, but this was where Mike's grit, strength and experience paid off. At Ramsey, 23 miles out on the start of the mountain climb, he was in the lead by a single second, but Aggo got the news from his signalling station there and speeded up yet again to lead by 2.5 seconds at the bungalow, 32 miles out. But then, disaster. The MV's chain came off as Aggo rounded Windy Corner. Amazingly, he coasted down and pushed into his pit. But his race was over after an inspired ride. No more inspired than Hailwood's, though, on a bike which was not worthy of his talent. It was a fantastic race, and I was like a limp rag at the end of it. Hailwood went on to race cars and Agostini to dominate the TT and World Championship races until he retired from motorcycle racing in 1977. But it was the end of an era. I wasn't finished with bikes, though. When the TT lost its World Championship status in 1977, Britain's place in the series was taken by the newly instituted short-circuit British Grand Prix, and I was in the commentary boxes at Silverstone and Donington Park until 1993. This was the era of my friend Barry Sheen, Kenny Roberts, Randy Mamela, Eddie Lawson, Freddie Spencer, Wayne Gardner, Kevin Schwantz, Wayne Rainey, and the start of the spellbinding career of the very greatest of his time, Mick Doohan. This period also saw the very rapid development of the big bike two-stroke era, with Honda once again taking the lion's share of the honours over the years. What a fantastic company it is! In 2001, it celebrated an unprecedented 500th Grand Prix win in less than 40 years of competition. Wonderful times and wonderful races. In 1957 came Scrambling, which not only dramatically increased my broadcasting tempo, but got me heavily involved with television for the first time. I think it also made a major contribution to my commentary style, because scrambling is the most exciting thing I've ever seen on two wheels, and it demands commentary to match. Scrambling is to motorcycles what steeplechasing is to horses. It started in Frimley, Surrey, on the 23rd of March 1923 with an event called the Southern Scott Scramble, a version of the historic Scott Trial in Yorkshire, where chaps on bikes competed in a long-distance time trial over a crucifying cross-country course with observed sections. Let's do the same thing, a bunch of Southern enthusiasts decided, but make it a cross-country race without the observed sections. Don't know what we'll call it, but it'll be a right old scramble. So began what is now a major worldwide sport which annually creates sales of many thousands of very specialised bikes, most of which are Japanese. Its modern name is motocross. Motocross is fast, furious, noisy and enormously spectacular, but not particularly dangerous. In the mid-1950s, the BBC dabbled with it, but ITV were the first really to give it a go with an event at Bentley Springs in Yorkshire, masterminded by my old friend Dennis Parkinson, a very talented road racer and 5-time winner of the Manx Grand Prix. He's the one that coined that memorable catchphrase, the undulating straight, which never sounds the same without his broad Yorkshire accent. Dennis was a huge enthusiast and wanted to put scrambling on the map. He badgered away at David Southwood, who was now head of sport of ABC TV, the Northern and Midlands contractor. The Bentley Springs event went down very well with the public, and I was contracted to commentate on a whole series of future meetings. It was my breakthrough into television. I'd done the odd thing on the box for the Beeb, but was now to do it on a regular basis for ITV. And for over 10 years, until 1968, it was a major part of my life and one which raised my profile with the public, because scrambling became as much of a must for Saturday and Sunday sports viewers as All In Wrestling with Kent Walton, snooker with Whispering Ted Lowe, and darts with Sid Waddell. The top riders of the day, Dave Curtis, Jeff Ward, Les Archer, Dave Bickers, Arthur Lamkin, Jeff Smith, Vic Eastwood and John Banks became national sporting heroes as people talked about their thrilling battles, which undoubtedly had a major effect on the way I commentated. There was no way I could be dispassionate about the way they rode. Fast and exciting action demanded fast and exciting words to describe it, and that suited me fine. When you're doing radio commentary, you're talking to people who can't see what's going on. So, for all action sports like car and motorcycle racing, you have to maintain a virtually non-stop flow of words to inform and hopefully entertain the listener with a verbal picture of what you see happening. But with television, the viewers see what you see, often better, for the cameras follow the action, and if you take your eyes off the monitor momentarily to look at your notes, you can easily miss something the viewer has seen. TV doesn't need the word intensity of radio, but by the time I got there, my style was set. Australia's favourite son, Clive James, said I commentated as though my trousers were on fire, and people used to say that what they liked best was my enthusiasm, which came from the heart by way of a lot of words. Pause, Murray, pause! My BBC TV producer Jim Reside would say to me over the headphones during Formula One commentaries, and I'd manfully try to give it a rest. But when you're bursting to tell people all about the riveting things that are happening before your very eyes, it's very difficult for anyone with a temperament like mine to dry up. The winter scrambles for ITV were pretty rugged. We did the long haul from London the night before an event, as there were still no motorways between us and Yorkshire, where most of them occurred. I'd spend as much time as I could in the paddock talking to the riders, officials and anyone else who could add to my knowledge, and then we'd disappear for the rest of the day into a rudimentary and often open-fronted commentary box containing just a TV monitor and a microphone. Dennis Parkinson was my co-commentator and Elizabeth my hapless lap scorer, charged with working out who was who and what lap they were on, as the unrecognisable mud-plastered apparitions blasted past us. Rider identification was often virtually impossible, and cynically I had the assurance of knowing that if I didn't know who was in the lead, the viewers certainly wouldn't. It was all exciting stuff, and in the heat of the moment, the words sometimes came out the wrong way. Arthur Lamkin, a very tough and determined Yorkshireman, was one of the top men riding a works BSA. The courses were fast, rough and bumpy, so the rider stood on the footrest to let his knees absorb the shock, with his backside thumping the foam rubber bum pad on the rear mudguard. At a race near Leeds Airport, Arthur was hurtling over the bumps at enormous speed when his bike took off and his feet left the rest as he shot into the air, grimly hanging on with just his hands. As he landed with his legs splayed open, his groin crunched down between the saddle and the bum pad, and I shouted excitedly into the microphone, "My God, he's trapped his knackers!" Except that, while the words were actually on the way from the brain to the mouth, I said to myself, "They're not going to like this, Murray." And actually ended up saying, "My God, he's trapped his knickers!" They were great days with ITV, but frankly it wasn't top quality stuff. Those pioneering early events were primarily low-cost time fillers. But they pulled the viewers, and the BBC was getting envious. In those days, BBC's grandstand was the TV sport colossus. As someone who spent many happy years with BBC TV sport, I find it very sad that it's now a shadow of its former great self. Although I did very well from my move to ITV, I regret the BBC's fall from grace. It was, however, the corporation's own fault. It had great people, superb facilities, unrivalled experience, historical dominance and enormous ability, and it let them all slide. But in the winter of 1962, when ITV had the ratings and the BBC didn't, it was a case of, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. The Beeb did just that, with an all-star event of its own on grandstand from Nash Hill near Chippenham. Brian Johnson was the producer, and Dave Bickers was the sensation who fired the nation. Dave, a laconic and dry-humoured chap from Suffolk, who's now one of Britain's leading film stunt organisers, was riding his famous 250cc two-stroke Greaves against the other stars. At the start, he stalled his engine and lost a full lap before he could get going. But when he did, he absolutely flew. Full on over the bumps with giant leaps and impossible speed through the twisties, hurtling past his rivals until, as the last lap started, he was second and gaining hand over fist on the leader. "This is bloody marvellous," shouted the new-to-it-all grandstand director Alex Weeks over the wires from the gallery in London. "Tell them to do another lap." Well, we couldn't do that, obviously, but the coverage was an enormous success, which increased the BBC's resolve to have scrambling on its screens. And this was exactly what the Competitions Committee at the Autocycle Union, the governing body of the sport, was after, for they rightly wanted to change the public perception of scrambling from that of ITV's localised mud bath club meets into one of slick and impressive professional events featuring the stars. There was nothing wrong with that, but it inflamed the feelings of the northern clubs who saw the ACU committee as a bunch of southern upstarts who were trying to steal their thunder by kidnapping their creation. All political hell was let loose as the two sides locked horns. It was the North and ITV against the South and BBC TV. For a while I worked for both channels, and on 2 occasions I was on both at the same time, with my live commentary for BBC TV clashing with an event I'd recorded previously for ITV. There was no getting away from me. But it couldn't last, and unsurprisingly, the BBC and ACU bosses won the day. The Beeb was given a contract to run events on grandstand, while the northern clubs and ITV were left fuming on the sidelines. While all this was going on, BBC TV's head of sport, Brian Cowgill, a dominant and forceful Lancastrian, caused me to appear before him. "We like this scrambling, Murray, and we're going to have it. We want you to do it, so I'm offering you a long-term contract. Now, of course, Murray, I know you work with ITV, and I want to make it quite clear that this contract in no way prevents you from carrying on with them. Should you do so, we'll continue to use you, for as long as it takes us to find a replacement." This was the end of my happy days with ITV. Until 1997, that is, when the boot would be very much on the other Schumacher, and ITV's crushing revenge would be very sweet, as it took Formula One from the BBC. But that was some 35 years ahead of me. The BBC did a superb job with scrambling, but all good things come to an end, and that's what happened to the BBC Grandstand Motocross series in the late 1960s. The spectacle was no less exciting, but seeing the same people weekend after weekend dulled the public appetite. My mother, God bless her, used to say to me, "Always remember, dear, that in life, when one door closes, another opens." And she was right. When the BBC decided that scrambling had run its course on the box, they switched to the same sort of thing on four wheels, rallycross, which turned me from being primarily a motorcycle sport commentator into mostly a car sport commentator. Rallycross might have been made for the box. It's tough, rough, full of high-speed action and very simple. Men, and the very occasional woman, race each other in cars that bear a passing resemblance to those you see every day on the roads, on short circuits that are part cross-country and part tarmac. It's no exaggeration to say that TV made rallycross, and without wishing to sound big-headed, I like to think that I had a part in its success, because my crash-bang-wallop commentary style fitted its all-action happenings perfectly. Elizabeth and I now had a much easier time on Fridays, driving south to the Chaucer Hotel in Canterbury, weekend after weekend, to be at Lyddon the next morning. We did some 40 meetings there over the years. There was a wonderfully matey atmosphere at Lyddon, despite or maybe because of its facilities, which were just about as basic as they could be. The race cars with their support vehicles were jumbled together on a grassy hillside paddock alongside the boomerang-shaped, chalk-based track, which was about a mile long. You parked where you could, and you took your own food. The trackside headquarters of the excellent Thames Estuary Automobile Club, dominated by the irascible but lovable Sid Offord, was a porter cabin, and the toilets were ramshackle, all-friends-together affairs at the end of the paddock, with just a canvas screen between the men and women's sections. On our side, there was a handwritten notice saying, "Gentlemen, keep your voices down. The ladies can hear every word you say." With morning practice followed immediately by the afternoon racing, there was non-stop activity. The buzz was great, and it made superb TV. The competitors were mostly associated with the motor trade, and many of the much modified cars they turned up with were extremely impressive. In the early days, the ubiquitous Mini was the hot favourite, widely available, inexpensive, easy to modify, and possessing superlative handling. A lot of the top men used them, until more ambitious and much more expensive machinery sent them to the back of the field. You name it in the way of production cars, and they were there in rallycross. Front-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive, four-wheel drive, normally aspirated and turbocharged, Ford Escorts, Hillman Imps, VW Beetles, Saabs, Ford Fiestas, Renault 5s, Golfs, Porsches, BMWs, Volvos, Skodas and DAFs. Yes, DAFs! The Dutch de Roy brothers from Eindhoven must have been made of solid testosterone. Chunky Jan and Hunky Harry, who ran a trucking business in Holland, looked like packing cases on legs and drove DAFs with their unique stepless transmission. It was the car that silver-haired old ladies used to bumble along in the middle of the road. Not the most suitable device for rallycross, you might think, but you'd be wrong. For the ones that Jan and Harry drove had 240 horsepower Ford BDA engines and went like stink. Saying that the Duroy's on-track behaviour was forceful is a bit like saying Bernie Ecclestone is well off. They were animals. And while they made great television as they tore round, through and over everyone else, their tactics were not always appreciated, which led to their being banned for dangerous driving. They weren't the only spectacular ones, though. Craggy-faced John Taylor drove a Ford Escort with a Cosworth BDA motor and was very much the man. "We fixed it for you to go round with, John," said BBC producer Ricky Tilling one day, "and we'll wire you up for commentary. Bit of a first, should be good." There was no passenger seat in the Escort, so I had to sort of crouch alongside the forceful Taylor, hanging onto the roll bar with one hand, while the other alternately stuffed the microphone inside my helmet and gripped the door pull as he proceeded to go berserk. A rocket-propelled up-through-the-gears start led to a full-lock, flat-out slide round greasy Chessons Drift, full chat along the bumpy Dover slope, off the grass-covered infield and onto the tarmac, up Hairy Hill, and then down again at breathtaking speed into Paddock Bend, which we exited in a colossal full-on drift, to be faced with the dreaded Mabs Bank, which should overturn a car as soon as look at it. 3 laps of this we did, and as we began the last, I felt an agonising pain in the side of my chest. As I babbled away about how riveting it all was, I thought I was going to faint. So when I finally fell out of the car, I tottered off to the circuit doctor. "You've broken a rib," he said matter-of-factly. "Nothing I can do about it. It'll get better in time, but it'll be a bit sore." "Thanks, John." Rallycross was full of great characters. Ron Douglas, super extrovert Barry Lee and jovial Rod Chapman were but 3 of many. But excitable and mustachioed Martin Schanker was the most incredible of them all, though. From Trondheim in Norway, he was not only a brilliant engineer who built amazing cars, like his turbocharged 420 horsepower Ford Escort, but he was also an extrovert showman. When he won, he'd do a victory lap standing on the doorsill, with only 1 foot inside the car to operate the accelerator. His driving was sensational, and it was Martin who motivated me to produce one of my more memorable Murrayisms. "The car in front is absolutely unique," I shouted as Schanker spectacularly led the way, "except for the one behind it, which is identical." How on earth, you may wonder, can anyone say anything as daft as that? Well, here's how. The heats at Lyddon were very quick fire. As 4 cars blasted off the line for their 4-lap sprint, the next 4 lined up ready to go as soon as those on the track finished their race. Sometimes, though, a car would drop out as they moved up to start, in which case the fastest car from the next batch would immediately take its place. Which is exactly what John Welch did in his Schanker-built Escort, identical to Martin's. So, during the race, as I was enthusing about Schanker in his, I thought, unique Escort, I produced the words, "The car in front is absolutely unique." But while I was actually saying them, I realised to my horror that John Welch, who was meant to be in the next batch, was right behind the master. So I hastily added, "except for the one behind it, which is identical." All very understandable under the circumstances, don't you think? Lyddon invariably made for great viewing, which usually involved something violent. There was the Keith Rip incident. Keith, another of the many characters of Rallycross, a 5-star driver and multiple British champion, came rocketing down Hairy Hill in his very special Mini, took Paddock Bend in a 2-wide slide and hit Mabs Bank at full speed. "Rip's in trouble," I perceptibly observed. And then, "He's in real trouble," as he took off, flew through the air, landed at undiminished speed and rolled end over end with the whole car literally disintegrating around him. I could hardly believe my eyes when it stopped, and Keith calmly extricated himself from the crumpled wreck. That sequence became part of the grandstand opening titles for a very long time, and Keith must have done very well out of the resultant publicity for his thriving car parts business. National TV coverage of motocross and rallycross may sadly be a thing of the past in Britain, but I owe them an enormous debt of gratitude, because they developed my commentary style and generated a lot of the foot-in-mouth Murrayisms for which I became known. To my mind, they're by far the most exciting two- and four-wheeled motorsports, and they demanded commentary to match. I loved them and still do. But when BBC TV's interest in the two sports dwindled to covering just their annual British Grand Prix, I certainly didn't find time hanging heavily on my hands. From the early 1980s right up to 1992, there were regular transmissions on grandstand of Formula Ford and Formula 3 races from all the main circuits, and I got to know many of today's Formula 1 stars there in their early careers. There were powerboats too, plus for a short while the new craze of truck racing, which made for mind-boggling television. To my great delight and satisfaction, I'd become the BBC's automatic choice as commentator whenever anything with an engine was involved. In 1988 came touring car racing, which along with Formula 1 would give the British public two enthralling motorsport spectacles for years to come. I'd been doing the odd touring car race for the BBC for years, but now they were to cover the whole of the RAC British Championship. Since it was then dominated by the awesome 500 horsepower, flame-spurting and turbo wastegate-chattering Ford Sierra Cosworth RS 500s, spectacular entertainment was guaranteed, and the BTCC coverage was to break new ground. Historically, the BBC had always covered sporting events entirely with its own people and its own facilities, cameras, equipment, production, technical and engineering personnel. But the government was determined to break its monopoly and decreed that it must now subcontract a percentage of its output to outside production companies. For the new touring car programmes, BBC TV therefore appointed BHP, owned and masterminded by my old friend Barry Hinchcliffe. BHP's brief from BBC TV was to deliver finished 30-minute programmes on videotape that had only to be checked and loaded into grandstand's transmitters. It was an inspired decision, and it worked wonderfully. Because of my Formula 1 commitments, I was able to attend very few of the actual BTCC events, but BHP filmed everything that moved, fitted on-car and in-car cameras, did the interviews, filmed the prize-giving, and then returned to London with miles of tape. This was edited down to the necessary half hour, notably by the ever-cheerful Steve Saint, now BHP's managing director. With far more footage than they could possibly use, BHP were able to select the really exciting stuff and link it together to make a half hour of non-stop action, drama and excitement. Heart-pounding race starts, thrilling passing manoeuvres, massive collisions, stirring in-car pictures, angry confrontations, explanatory graphics. It was all there, and it was fabulous. I'd go to the actual events whenever possible, and sometimes I'd gloomily think, heaven knows what BHP will be able to do with that lot. Nothing happened. But when I got to Fitzroy Square the following Thursday to add the commentary, I'd be so fired up by what I saw that I could hardly wait to get at it and add my words. It was exceedingly hard work. With a normal commentary, you talk continuously about the pictures you see on your monitor, which are identical to those the viewer sees at home. Your words don't have to coincide exactly with every vision change because the coverage is continuous. And that enables you to overlap sequences while you interpret the pictures and add verbal colour. The BTC situation was very different though. The pictures would leap from a fight between 3 cars at the front to 4 others battling for 10th place. Mislaps where nothing had happened, and then suddenly show a huge collision as three cars not previously shown took each other off, followed by in-car replays of how it all happened. In short, the whole thing was dramatically edited highlights rather than whole race coverage. Every picture sequence was there for a reason that had to be explained in commentary, but every one of them also had to appear to flow out of the one before and into the one that followed, although in truth they may have been separated by several laps. I therefore had to sit at an editing machine and methodically go through every inch of the tape, studying how it had been put together to tell the race story, before I could even think about what the words were to be. Then I used to go into the sound booth and commentate on the tape pictures that were pumped into a monitor in front of me. It used to take me 7 hours for a half-hour programme, but I like to think the effort was worth it, and the viewing figures certainly seemed to show that it was. In the early days, all sorts of unlikely cars won the British Championship, from an Austin A40 to a Ford Galaxy, and a Hillman Avenger to a Sunbeam Imp. But in my opinion, it came of age for the TV public with the stirring turbocharged Ford Sierra RS500 battles between the great Andy Rouse, Steve Soper, Tim Harvey, Lawrence Bristow, Rob Gravitt and Jerry Marnie. After 3 years, the BTCC lost its impact because of the domination of the Fords up front and the complications of the overall championship. Frank Sittner won it in a Class B 2-litre BMW in 1988, and John Cleland in a Class B Vauxhall Astra in 1989, for instance, in spite of the fact that the Class A Sierras were ahead of them on the track. The races were terrific, but the whole thing was just too messy to grasp. So it was both a relief to me and a real shot in the arm for the series when Australia's Alan Gow arrived like a knight in shining armour to transform the BTCC, making it a great television spectacle. Alan was and is a clear-thinking, no-nonsense Australian entrepreneur who knew the motor racing business backwards. Seeing a great business opportunity, he set up a commercial company, named it Toka, took over the championship from the RAC and with great professionalism completely reorganised it. There was a new name, Super Touring, a single 2-litre engine capacity, a great deal with BBC TV to cover the championship, a skilled and experienced permanent staff to cover all the needs from organisation and administration to scrutineering and medical services, and aggressive promotion to attract the crowds. There were also sophisticated hospitality facilities for VIP guests, proper briefings for the media, top drivers readily accessible to the spectators for autographs, its own radio station, and, of course, the best circuits. The manufacturers loved it. The racing was tremendous, and its success was absolute. Crowds of over 30,000 turned up regularly at 12 meetings a year at Britain's main circuits, and the BBC audiences were well over 3.5 million. Soon, France, Italy, Sweden, Germany, Spain, Portugal, South Africa, Australia, and even America followed in Toka's pioneering footsteps, and Alan was involved with it all. It was a great achievement, which dramatically affected me, for now I was the voice of motorsport's two top disciplines, Formula One and touring cars, with enormous worldwide viewing figures. End of Side 2. Side 3. I enjoyed my time with the BTCC immensely. Not so good from my point of view, though, was the fact that the BBC, stung by their loss of Formula One to ITV, decided to double the time for BTCC programmes from 30 minutes to a full hour, and also to do some of the meetings live. I thought it was wrong then, and I still do. I don't think the 1997 BTCC live coverage was nearly as exciting as the recorded and edited output. The thing that finally got to me, though, was the 1 hour slot. For each programme, I had to make a 3-hour journey to and from home, spend 2 7-hour days at BHP slogging away at an editing machine, and have an overnight stay in London. I very reluctantly decided that enough was enough and told the BBC I didn't want to renew my contract for 1998. They were charming and said they fully understood. But the sad fact for me was that this was the end of my time with the greatest broadcasting organisation in the world. I'd enjoyed it all and was very proud of what I'd been able to achieve with them, but there was no doubt in my mind that it was time to go. In 1978, BBC TV made the major decision to feature the entire Formula One season in its sports lineup. Before then, there'd only been limited coverage confined to glamour events like Monaco, the British and Italian races, commentated by the authoritative Raymond Baxter. So this was an exciting development. However, from the BBC's point of view, there was a problem. On-car advertising. Most of the major teams had tobacco firm sponsorship, and the BBC, which was worried about any form of advertising on its channels, reluctantly agreed to stomach tobacco's association with Formula One because it regarded the sport as a special case. But the idea of sponsorship by condom firms was something else, and when the Surtees team appeared with the word Durex boldly displayed on its bodywork, there was a crisis. In 1976, as far as the BBC was concerned, a Durex logo was totally unacceptable for family viewing. I arrived at Brands Hatch to be greeted by producer Ricky Tilling. "Hi, Murray. We'll know by 11 o'clock whether we're going to be on or not." "What are you talking about, Ricky?" "Durex. We're not going to transmit the race unless Surtees agree to take it off their cars." Surtees refused, so the BBC packed up and went home. By 1978, however, Durex had largely disappeared from the scene, and now, with public interest fired by James Hunt's dramatic and successful battle with Niki Lauda for the 1976 World Championship, the sport was about to take off on the box. The charismatic James was the nation's new sporting hero, and time was right to exploit Formula One's enormous potential. Raymond Baxter was not available, and I was in pole position to replace him. Over lunch, Jonathan Martin, then one of the BBC TV's top sports producers, outlined the situation to me. After the first 4 long-haul events in Argentina, Brazil, South Africa and America, we're going to do recorded highlights of the European races, starting with Monaco. I want you to do the commentary, Murray. The drill will be for you to go to the event on the Thursday of race week, soak yourself in it until after qualifying on Saturday, and then come back to the UK. You'll watch the actual race on Eurovision at the TV Centre on Sunday, and then we'll edit it down to half an hour of highlights, onto which you'll dub the commentary for transmission later that evening. The BBC were never the best of payers, but given that I'd got the job of a lifetime, I wasn't too concerned about the money, and it was only a 3-year contract after all. Little did I know that 24 years of travelling the world to 39 circuits in 20 countries to talk about my consuming interest stretched before me. BBC TV's Grand Prix was judged a great success and soon outgrew its original format to go live. But those early highlights programmes were very demanding. When I got back on the Saturday night, I used to go to the Kensington Hilton Hotel at Shepherd's Bush, and then, on Sunday, to the television centre for the race. Under great pressure and working against the clock, 2 teams of producers and videotape editors would reduce the coverage to half an hour, and I'd make notes of what was going into the programme. Then it was headphones on to record commentary on the condensed event as though I was watching it live, while Jonathan Martin bellowed into my headphones about what was coming up next. If you want to know what it was like, try standing in your living room, excitedly describing what you can see out of the window, while your wife gives you a furious earful about coming home drunk with a pair of knickers in your pocket. Well, it was certainly hectic. And when the editing couldn't be finished in time to record the words before the programme went on the air, I had to do the commentary live on transmission, and very occasionally without even having seen the pictures. But whenever that wonderfully evocative theme music began, The Chain by Fleetwood Mac, I knew that when it stopped, I'd be starting. The butterflies in my stomach had settled, and it'd be down to me to capture the excitement, the drama, the colour, the noise, and the danger that's Formula One. And it was a fabulous feeling. What made 1979 so significant for me was that at Monaco, James Hunt lost his appetite for racing and sensationally retired. Before long, I was having another audience with the redoubtable Jonathan Martin. The Grand Prix programme's taking off, Murray. Next year we're going to do all the European races live, and we're going to have 2 commentators. You're one, and James Hunt will be the other. I didn't like it. They're easing me out, was my first thought. Next they'll be saying, thanks for all you've done, Murray, but we want a younger man who's actually done it. But James Hunt? As a driver, he's very good. As a person, he's arrogant, rude, overbearing, and drinks too much. Certainly not someone with whom I want to share a microphone. I was certainly startled at our first joint commentary on the International Trophy race at Silverstone, a procession won by Chile's Eliseo Salazar, and definitely not one of the most exciting races I've ever seen. I summed it up as brightly as I could and turned to James, who was lying on the floor of the commentary box with his leg in plaster as a result of trying to do a backflip on a snowboard while he was under the influence. And what did you think of it, James? What a load of rubbish, he replied. Direct and blunt, but he was absolutely right. James said it like he saw it. It was my first experience of that complete honesty and outspokenness which was to endear him so much to the viewers. But there were plenty more to come. The trouble with Jarrier is that he's a French wally. Always has been and always will be, was a typical James remark. The public loved James' tirades, and at Monaco in 1980 there began the Murray and James Formula One commentary partnership that was to last for 13 years, and, as we rubbed the corners off each other, developed into mutual respect and liking. Now, 2 people could hardly have been more different in terms of age, temperament, background and attitudes. James was a free spirit with a highly volatile and forcefully opinionated personality and a fearsome temper. For years he'd been lionised by his fans and given no peace by the media. He'd lost his wife to Richard Burton, terminated a career that had seen him become world champion of a sport where you literally put your life at risk. Drank to excess, smoked to excess, womanised to super excess, and was now literally yesterday's man. And how about me? Well, at 57 I was more than old enough to be his father, and unhappy about being paired off with someone I thought was lazy and unprofessional, and whose private life I didn't admire. At that first Grand Prix together, our Monaco commentary position was a patch of pavement opposite the pit lane. We sat on folding park chairs just behind the Armco barrier, on the other side of which the cars blasted past at some 170 miles an hour. Between us was a solitary television monitor, and over us a token piece of canvas in case it rained. The noise was deafening, and to make it worse, I wore an earpiece into which Jonathan Martin gave me the time of day in his imperious tones. Just minutes before the race, James arrived, unkempt, unshaven, barefoot and half-sloshed, wearing a T-shirt and a frayed pair of cut-down jeans and carrying a bottle of wine. He sat down, plonked his plaster cast into my lap, and off we went. I can look at the situation with wry humour now, but I wasn't amused at the time. Life with James was always unpredictable. I used to see very little of him before the qualifying session on Saturday, and on Sunday he'd stroll in about 5 minutes before the race began. And when it finished, it was as though the checkered flag was connected to a spring on his arse. As the flag swept down, James shot up and out of the box. But as the years rolled by, he changed, very much for the better as far as I was concerned. And I must have too. We both mellowed. His second marriage had produced 2 sons, Tom and Freddie, to whom he was a loving and very caring father. He used to bring them to Portugal for a holiday at Grand Prix time, and over the years the decent and cheerful chap that had always been inside him took over, and our relationship was transformed. In 1993, though, things were bad for James. His many investments had gone belly up. His divorce was turning out to be extremely messy and expensive. His Mercedes-Benz SL 500 was sitting on bricks in front of his home without its wheels, and he was so strapped financially that he could only afford to drive a very old Austin A30 van. So, to save money and keep fit, he cycled almost everywhere. That Sunday, we did the broadcast for the Canadian Grand Prix at Shepherd's Bush with no problems. It was the 4th of Alain Prost's 7 wins for Williams that year. And after he had done his Daily Telegraph column with journalist Jerry Donaldson, James cycled back to Wimbledon. 2 days later, I was doing a job when my wife phoned me. "Brace yourself, dear," she said. "I've got some very bad news. It's James. He's died." Now, a human reaction can be quite illogical, and mine was, "It can't be James, I was with him on Sunday." Sadly, though, he'd succumbed to a massive heart attack, and to my very genuine regret, our long association was over. At the end of 1995, Grand Prix had been running for 18 years and was doing very well. The public loved it. The audience ratings were impressive, and BBC TV head of sport Jonathan Martin was negotiating with Bernie Ecclestone, the Tsar of Formula One, for another 5 years of the same. Little did Jonathan know, though, that ITV was sick of being cut to ribbons by Grand Prix on Sunday afternoons, and had decided that if they couldn't beat it, they'd buy it. In went a mammoth offer of some £60 million, with the promise greatly to improve the show. On the 13th of December, Jonathan's phone rang. "It's Bernie, Jonathan." "Hi, Bernie, how are you?" "Fine, thanks. I just rang to tell you that you've lost the contract and that we're making the announcement in half an hour's time." When the shell-shocked Jonathan picked himself up off the floor, he said, "Bernie, you might have given us a chance to make a counterbid." To which Bernie replied, "Unless you've been cheating me all these years, there's no way you can pay what they're paying, so there was no point in asking." Terse and tough, but true. The end of an era. Bernie subsequently said to me, "I didn't do it just for the money. ITV are going to make a much better job of it." Now, I knew nothing about the ITV coup until I turned on my car radio. To say that I was flabbergasted would be a massive understatement. "That's it then," I thought. "You've had it." But to my surprise and delight, I got a phone call from ITV's Mike Southgate early in the new year, saying he'd like to come and talk to me. When he arrived with Andrew Chowns, ITV's legal eagle, he got straight to the point. "We want you to carry on with us, Murray. You'll be #1 commentator, and this is what we'll pay you." It was a hell of a lot more than I was already getting. I was sworn to secrecy and had to profess ignorance about my future for the whole of 1996, as the media speculated about what would be happening to me. I had the most incredible support from nearly all the papers, including the Times, Sunday Times and Sunday Express, and wonderful pieces by Kate Battersby in the Evening Standard and Jeremy Clarkson in The Sun. But most amazing of all was the Daily Mirror's Save Our Murray campaign. After a fabulous last season with BBC, which saw my most emotional commentary of all when my friend Damon Hill won the World Championship in Japan, ITV announced that Jim Rosenthal was to lead the presentation team with Tony Jardine and Simon Taylor, working in a superb £1 million mobile facility that had to be transported to all the European circuits. Martin Brundle and I would be the commentators, and the two pit lane presenters would be James Allen and Louise Goodman. A very well-deserved first for a woman in televised Formula One. It turned out to be an absolutely wonderful team that I had the greatest joy in working with for the next 5 years. How did Martin Brundle get into the act? Quite simply because he was the best man for the job, a broadcasting natural. He's one of those rare individuals, someone who's supremely good at his sport, 8 Formula One teams, every place in the points except first, world sports car champion and winner at Le Mans, who can talk eloquently and entertainingly about what he does so well. His grid walks before the races were to become one of the audience's favourite features, and his throwaway one-liners in the box were a delight that made our partnership sound exactly like it was. Fun. No disrespect to the BBC, but ITV were true to their word and made a much better job of their Formula One coverage. When I was commentating, most of what I said came out of my head, but I had 3 vital visual aids to hand in the commentary box. These were a map of the course with all the gear changes, engine revs, car speeds and advertising hoardings marked on it, a handwritten aid memoir containing information on the drivers and race records which I prepared before every race, and another which detailed the top 6 race positions and the championship placings for that year's events. Before I left home, I made sure to look at the video and read the race report of the previous year's event, and to check my commentator's kit bag, which contained everything I was likely to need, from my vital electronic pass and a penknife to throat sweets, rolls of sellotape, a waterproof, and notebook and pens. Thursday was the most relaxed of the 4-day event. I used to walk the course to check any changes and mark the advertising bridges on a map which I taped underneath my monitor in the box. It was invaluable for locating where the cars were on the track when the producer went from one shot to another. Thursday was also for chatting and socialising with the teams, and throughout the weekend I could breakfast with one of them in their motorhome, have lunch with another, and dinner with a third. The food and wines were of the highest quality, and so was the company. As a Formula One fan, I was in my 7th heaven. Friday saw 2 one-hour sessions of practice, and I used to watch them from the commentary box to get a feel of what it was going to be like on race day. Saturday would start with more of the same and build up to the 1-hour qualifying session. In the box I had 2 monitors to look at. One gave me the broadcaster's pictures and the other the telemetry information, which was as important as the race pictures. All the cars were equipped with transmitters, and when they crossed the start line, a signal was sent to a central computer which transmitted a non-stop flood of information to screens in the control tower, the team positions on the pit wall, the hospitality suites and the commentary boxes. By constantly punching buttons while I talked, I could see the race order, the lap times, the 3 individual lap sector times, the gaps between cars, who was gaining and who was dropping back, what the fastest lap was, who'd retired, what incidents there'd been, what lap everybody was on, and a lot more besides. The advent in the 1980s of all this instant knowledge literally transformed commentary. Where before I'd had to rely on a handwritten lap chart, converting race numbers into drivers' names in my head and juggling with a stopwatch while I was talking, I now had it all there in front of me, accurate to 1,000th of a second. Sunday was what it was all about, though. Race day. With the crowds pouring in, the flags and banners, the high-rolling sponsors filling the unbelievably expensive Paddock Club to drink champagne, eat superb meals and be addressed by the drivers, plus the build-up to the start, it made for a wonderful atmosphere. After the final half-hour of practice in the morning, there was a seemingly endless 4-hour wait to let the teams finalise their cars, while the tension before the race slowly increased. James Allen and Louise Goodman would spend nearly an hour setting the scene with background stories and interviews, and Martin would do his grid walk. Then, after my energetic limbering up exercises in the commentary box to get the adrenaline flowing, I'd be poised like an athlete on the start line, waiting for those 5 red lights to come on above the twin lines of multicoloured projectiles, with their engines screaming at some 18,000 RPM. Lights out, and the race was on. Go, go, go! The start was always the most exciting part of the race. When those 5 lights went out, some 18,000 horsepower was going to be fed to the rear wheels of the 22 cars, and they were all going to arrive at the first corner closer to each other than at any other stage of the race. The spectacle was fantastic, the noise unbelievable, and the likelihood of there being a multiple collision was considerable. So there was massive tension in the commentary box and an explosion of emotion as the cars leapt forward. You're living on your nerves and reflexes all the time in the box. Formula One isn't like football, athletics, boxing, cricket, where the spectators in the grandstand can see all the action. With no specific point of reference, like a ball, you have to follow 22 competitors racing round a 2.5-mile circuit at speeds of up to 200 miles an hour. They get strung out, sometimes collide, make pit stops, lose position, rejoin the race, use different strategies, lap each other, crash, go off, retire, and form an ever-changing pattern which the viewer has no way of interpreting for himself. The commentator has to do it for him. I loved it. But with a dangerous sport like motor racing, there's an ever-present threat of disaster. The hardest thing I ever had to deal with was the most publicised and visible accident in the history of motorsport, the death of Ayrton Senna. The 1994 San Marino Grand Prix meeting at Imola had already had grim happenings, and at the start of the race on Sunday there was a collision that sent a wheel into the crowd and brought the safety car out until the debris could be cleared. On lap 7 the race resumed, with Senna's Williams just ahead of Michael Schumacher's Benetton. But as Ayrton took the Tamburello curve, he slammed into the concrete wall at some 135 miles an hour. In previous years, I'd seen Michele Alboreto, Nelson Piquet and Gerhard Berger do the same thing at the same place and come to little harm. In Berger's case, despite his being unconscious while the car caught fire. So my immediate reaction to Senna's crash was one of excitement rather than horror. "Wow, that's a big one," was my first thought. But it was immediately obvious that it was a lot more than that. The race was stopped as the medical staff, under the direction of Professor Sid Watkins, tried to save the stricken Senna's life. The greatest racing driver in the world was lying gravely injured beside the track, and I was by now fearing the worst. I obviously had no justification for making reassuring statements like, "Don't worry, I know it looks bad, but I've seen things like this before at this very place where the drivers were okay. Today's cars are very strong, and I'm sure Senna will be all right." Nor could I say, "This is terrible. I fear from the body language of the medics around Senna that this is a potentially fatal accident." For what seemed like hours, the horrible scenes continued until a helicopter took the mortally wounded Brazilian to the hospital, where he died. A truly great man had met his maker, and I honestly do not know how I found the right words to cope with it. When I reported to the BBC at Silverstone for my first broadcast in 1949, Formula One did not yet exist. Alfa Romeo and Maserati ruled the Grand Prix circuits. Ferrari had yet to win. There were only 5 major races, and British cars and drivers were of no consequence. The cars had their engines in front, and the drivers wore thin cotton trousers, short-sleeved T-shirts and linen helmets. They had no safety belts, and their cars were flimsy death traps. There were no barriers between them and the spectators lining the track, and no gravel traps to slow them if they went off. The medical facilities were minimal. In those days, So soon after a world war that had taken literally millions of lives, attitudes towards death were very different. Motor racing is dangerous. If they don't like it, they don't have to do it, was the general view, and several drivers were killed each season with no great reaction except regret. In the mid-1960s, however, Jackie Stewart courageously championed a much vilified crusade for greater safety, which gradually led to major improvements. Thanks mainly to the untiring efforts of Bernie Ecclestone, FIA President Max Mosley, and FIA Chief Medical Officer Professor Sid Watkins, it's all very different now, with safer circuits, safer cars, infinitely better medical facilities, fireproof clothing, and greatly improved marshalling. Ayrton Senna's tragic death was the catalyst for even greater efforts to make Formula One safer, with major changes to car construction and the regulations. But the drivers don't dwell on the fact that their job could take their life. It may happen to others, but it won't happen to me, is the usual, if unrealistic, attitude. They never talk about it, and to be honest, I never raised the subject during interviews. Everyone knew it could happen. Everyone hoped it wouldn't. Of course, none of them would race if they thought they were going to be killed, but the fact is that they could be, and retirement from racing is often caused by the belief that the risks are no longer acceptable. That was certainly the case with James Hunt, and I believe it was with Damon Hill too. No one was more conscious of the hazards than Senna, but he adopted a fatalistic attitude and just got on with it. Nevertheless, his concern for his fellow drivers in what is an extremely selfish profession was unusual. During that fateful weekend at Imola, Ayrton visited his countryman Rubens Barrichello in hospital after his high-speed crash on the Friday, and the following day, very much against the rules, commandeered a course car to get to the scene of Austrian driver Roland Ratzenberger's fatal crash. There had not been a death at a Grand Prix since 12 years earlier, when Osella driver Riccardo Paletti was killed at the 1982 Canadian Grand Prix, and Ratzenberger's death was a wake-up call for everyone. Sid Watkins suggested to the badly shaken Senna that he should withdraw from the next day's race, but Ayrton felt it was his destiny to continue, and did so, with tragic results. Motor racing can never be entirely safe, and nor do I think it should be. Of course, it should always be the objective to have safer cars and circuits, better medical facilities and protective clothing, but not to the extent that it encourages dangerous driving. Knowing how safe today's racing conditions are, the modern Grand Prix driver already takes risks that would have been regarded as suicidal in the 1950s. Would Stirling Moss have taken the 150-mile-an-hour risk to pass Fangio that Senna, enraged by what he felt to be an injustice, took in attempting to overtake Prost in Japan in 1990? Definitely not. Neither Senna nor Prost was even scratched by the collision that took them both out, but in the flimsy cars of Stirling's time, death would almost certainly have been the penalty. And if motor racing was sanitised to the extent that it posed no risks, where would the line be drawn in other hazardous sports? No more mountain climbing? No more parachuting? No more fishing? You'd be amazed at how many deaths that causes. Senna was right. The individual should be left to make his own mind up about whether the risks are acceptable. So, what's it like to drive a Formula One car? In 1983, I got the chance to find out. Ron Dennis's McLaren team had fought back against the turbocharged Ferraris to finish second in the 1982 championship with a normally aspirated Ford DFV engine in the brilliant MP4 designed by John Barnard, and with Niki Lauda and John Watson at the wheel. I was leaving a lunch when Ron asked me if I'd ever driven a Formula One car. My response was no. When he then asked if I wanted to, my answer was an unequivocal yes. Not long afterwards, the phone rang. "Get to Silverstone on Thursday, Murray. You're on." Full of eager anticipation, I rode up on my BMW motorcycle, and Ron gave me a duffel bag, telling me, "Get into this lot. You'll be going out in the lunch hour." This lot was a set of Niki Lauda's overalls, fireproof Nomex long johns and vest, racing boots, and a pair of racing gloves to accompany my own helmet. To my delight, I got into Niki's gear without a struggle and then took stock of things. It was a Goodyear tyre test day, and all the teams were there. "We're looking forward to the lunch hour, Murray," one of my mates said, and it suddenly struck me that I was going out on my own for the first time in a Formula One car, watched by people I'd been talking about frankly for years, and they'd be waiting with relish for me to get it very wrong. BBC TV were also there to record a feature on my epic drive. So, with my co-commentator, world champion James Hunt as my guide and mentor, my pride was very much at stake. James's advice was this: just remember two things, Murray. Don't stall it, and make sure you stop at the right garage when you come in. If you don't, the mechanics will have to push you. You won't be very popular, and you'll lose face. So, in my Unipart-sponsored MP4 carrying John Watson's number 7, I gave it a bootful and shot out of the pit lane like a cork out of a bottle, nearly running over a cameraman's foot. Other than that, though, there were no worries, and at the end of the lap I came in for the usual check. It was on leaving the second time that I stalled the car to produce the embarrassing head-nodding shot that's been shown on television countless times. But, loving every second of it, I stayed out for lap after lap, grimly concentrating on getting the line right for Copse Corner, and totally failing to see the "come in" arrow that McLaren had been showing me as I passed the pits. When I finally spotted it, I expertly drew up to the McLaren garage and stopped, only to see with horror that Ken Tyrrell was standing beside me. "Oh my God, I've stopped at the Tyrrell garage by mistake." "Don't move," said Ken, as I went to get out. "Next time, come in when you're told to. 3 times you stayed out, right?" "Yes, Ken, sorry." And off he went, chuckling. Always out for a bit of fun. He'd seen what was going on and taken the opportunity to give me a ribbing. I found it wasn't difficult to drive the McLaren. With a superb manual gearbox, a light clutch, and only 500 horsepower, about which Lauda was very disparaging, it was like an incredibly high-powered motorbike. Terrific power, superbly responsive, sensational acceleration, and unbelievable brakes. "Well done, Murray," said James when I got out of the car. "You've done something that any Grand Prix driver would give his eye teeth for." "Oh, have I? What's that?" "You've improved your lap time by half a minute." When I was floating around on Cloud 9 afterwards, John Watson asked what speed I was doing down Hanger Straight. "I don't know, John. They don't have speedometers. I thought you knew that." "Ha ha, very funny. How many revs were you pulling then?" "I just saw a flash of 9,000. What gear were you in?" "In top, of course." "Murray, that's 150 miles an hour." "Amazing. I certainly wouldn't have been doing that if I'd realised how fast it was." I was immensely indebted to Ron Dennis that day, but 15 years later, I was to become even more so. In 1998, McLaren had the inspired idea of producing a Formula One tandem two-seater to give a very few incredibly privileged people the ultimate thrill of experiencing race-speed Formula One performance with a star driver. With their brilliant designer Gordon Murray in charge, the team made a full specification Formula One car powered by a state-of-the-art 10-cylinder Mercedes-Benz engine identical to those in the 1998 team cars. Thanks to a much smaller fuel tank, which compensated for the passengers' weight, its performance was little inferior to the single-seaters that Mika Häkkinen and David Coulthard drove to win that year's World Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. I was to be one of only 3 passengers on its press launch day at Silverstone, and I was to be driven by my commentary box colleague Martin Brundle. The car looked and felt superb as I snuggled down into the minimal space behind Martin. I had to splay my legs as wide as I could until they were immovably compressed between the inside of the tub and the outside of Martin's seat. The 6-point harness over my thighs, shoulders and waist was tightened until I couldn't move a muscle, and then a massive carbon fibre bar was pinned tight up against my chest to support the back of Martin's seat. Now, I'm not claustrophobic, but I could sympathise with several of his subsequent passengers who chickened out at the last moment. I had the choice of resting my hands on my knees under the bar or having them immovably trapped between it and my chest. I chose the latter, in the naive belief that if anything happened I could, with one mighty bound, spring free. On with the Nomex balaclava, a neck brace to steady my head against the G-forces, my helmet, and the thick padded plastic collar that ran round the cockpit rim to absorb helmet impact if we hit something. I had a panic button with a big red light to alert Martin if things got too much for me, but there was no way I was going to use it. "What happens if we go off into the Armco backwards and the car catches fire?" I asked Martin. "You'll be out like a jackrabbit, but I'll be trapped by all this gubbins." "That won't happen, Murray." "Why not?" "Well, it won't, and there's not much petrol in it anyway." And with that comforting knowledge, we shot out of the pit lane. 3 laps in the wet, and then in. McLaren had said that no one, but no one, was ever going to do more than 3 laps. But when we stopped, Martin expressed the opinion that it hadn't been very exciting and suggested that if it dried out in the lunch hour, we'd have another go. I thought it was bloody exciting and couldn't wait for another ride. Sure enough, the track dried and Martin said, "Do you think you can stand 5 laps this time? If you can, we can do an out lap, 3 quick ones, and then in." "Martin, I'll stand 5 laps if it kills me. I'm never going to be able to do this again." What an experience. "You'll think I've forgotten my breaking point," said Martin, "but I won't have." It's a good thing he told me, because we took cops at 140 miles an hour, hurtled through the daunting Maggots-Beckett's Chapel complex at what seemed suicidal speed, hit 190 miles an hour down the Hangar Straight, got up to 165 miles an hour on the way up from Club Corner to Abbey, and held it until, with no change in the wailing cry of the 800-horsepower Mercedes-Benz engine just behind me, I could see the Abbey apex approaching at undiminished speed. This is what he said it was going to be like, I thought, so I suppose it's all right. But I also told myself that after 75 years of happiness, life really didn't owe me anything. Then those fantastic brakes took over, and in literally just a few yards we slowed to 50 miles an hour, powered through the tight left-right, and rocketed up to the unforgettable sensation of taking Bridge Corner without even a lift. I reckon I'm pretty fit. But as we entered the 5th lap, I'd had enough. Even though you're so tightly constrained in the cockpit that you can't move a millimetre, you still experience the enormous braking and cornering G-forces. Your guts go on when your body brakes with the car, and if you fail to brace your head, it ricochets between the driver's headrest in front of you and your own behind you. If Martin had said, "Another lap?" on the intercom, through which I could hear his shouts of "Yee-haw!" my pride would probably have made me agree. But I wouldn't really have wanted to. I was exhausted. In still slightly slippery conditions, we'd gone round only 8 seconds slower than a really good lap in a top race car, and my already enormous respect for the skill, fitness and stamina of the Grand Prix driver multiplied 10 times over that memorable day. Magic! If, like my mother, I live to be 100, I'll never forget it. I'm forever being asked who was the greatest champion, and I always say it's impossible to compare directly drivers from different eras in different cars on different circuits and with different rules. Was Jim Clark better than Michael Schumacher? Was Jackie Stewart better than Alain Prost? I could give you subjective answers, but I certainly couldn't prove that I was right. For what it's worth, the greatest racing driver of them all, in my opinion, was Italy's immortal Tazio Nuvolari, who raced mostly before the war, and who I was lucky enough to see winning the 1938 Donington Grand Prix for Auto Union. He was a charismatic genius. But as far as Formula One's concerned, which began in 1950, there's one man who, for me, stands out above all the rest, regardless of era. Juan Manuel Fangio, Formula One's 5-time world champion, who uniquely took the supreme honour 4 years in succession, 1954 to 1957, with 4 different constructors: Alfa Romeo, Mercedes-Benz, Ferrari and Maserati. It's true that he only drove in 51 World Championship races. There were only 7 or 8 a year in his day, and that he always had the best car. But he won 24 of those races, over 40%, and had the best car because he was the best driver, and therefore had the constructors beating a path to his door. Fangio was a quiet Argentinian with a winning smile and gentlemanly charm, who, like Nuvolari before him and Senna after him, had charisma oozing out of his hair roots. He was one of those very rare people who create a buzz of respectful excitement the moment they enter a room. He didn't even start racing in Formula One until he was 39, an age by which most Grand Prix drivers have retired these days, and he was 46 when he brilliantly won one of the greatest races of all time, the 1957 German Grand Prix at the fabled Nürburgring, to take his 5th championship before retiring as a living legend to his beloved birthplace of Balcarce in Argentina. One of Fangio's greatest admirers was a very wealthy Italian, Count Volpi, who'd run his own team in the 1950s. In 1984, as a mark of his respect, he commissioned the great producer, Hugh Hudson, of Chariots of Fire fame, to produce a film on Fangio's life. The result was superb. Monaco was closed out of season to film the great man driving the Maserati 250F in which he'd been victorious 27 years before. Thrilling sequences from his epic long-distance Chevrolet race wins in South America were recreated, and Fangio drove his 1955 championship-winning Mercedes-Benz W196 again for the cameras. But oddly, the finished film story climaxed at the beginning, with brilliantly edited footage of his historic 1957 Nürburgring win. Hugh Hudson asked me to do the commentary, which I did. But about a year later, when the film had still not appeared, I had a call from him. Count Volpi isn't happy, Murray. He wants the German race to be the end instead of the beginning. And that makes a nonsense of your words, so I'd like you to do them again. It'll mean a trip to Rome, though, I'm afraid. I wasn't complaining. I flew first class to Rome, where I was collected by a chauffeur-driven Mercedes-Benz 500 stretch limousine and taken to a suite in the magnificent Excelsior Hotel. The next day I reported to the studios. "We'll have to wait for Count Volpi," said the American editor. Now, in my mind's eye, the Count was a short, fat, bald and dark Italian in a blue serge suit. But when he arrived, he was tall, languid, immaculately dressed in a Harris tweed sports coat and flannels, spoke superb English, and had with him one of the most stunning women I've ever seen, positively dripping with jewellery and breeding. The editor indicated he was ready, and off I went, 20 to the dozen. At the end, I was well pleased with what I'd done for my simulated live commentary, particularly for the final laps of the race, when Fangio, pushing his Maserati way beyond the limits, caught and passed the Ferraris of Peter Collins and Mike Hawthorne after what had seemed like a disastrously long pit stop. "Was that okay, Count Volpi?" asked the editor. "Yes, very good indeed, but halfway through Murray said, 'And then, Fangio.' I think it would have been better if he'd said, 'But then, Fangio.'" "Count Volpi," I said, "I'll gladly do the whole thing again." I was being paid an obscene amount of money. But you have to realise that it was all coming out of my head, not a script. Next time I might not say "and" or "but." Anyway, I did it again, and this time the Count was happy, and so was I. But for me, the best of Fangio was still to come. In 1987, Pirelli, whose tyres Fangio had used, organised a magnificent lunch in his honour at Whitbread's London brewery. I was asked to host it and do a film interview with the great man, so I spent a whole morning with the maestro. I'd always thought of him as a bit uncommunicative, but discovered that this was because he only spoke Spanish. But with the help of Pirelli's gifted linguist, Robert Newman, we got on very well indeed, and I was charmed by my hero. At the age of 76, he had just arrived off a flight from Brazil, where, at 125 miles an hour, the steering wheel had come off the Formula One Mercedes-Benz he had been demonstrating. But he could still tell me what gears he'd been in and what revs he'd been pulling in the Maserati, all around the tortuous 14-mile Nürburgring during his inspired laps in the 1957 German Grand Prix. "Things are so much better now," he said. "Alberto Ascari and my friend Sterling Moss, who drove with me for Mercedes in 1955, were my greatest rivals. You have to be calm and collected as a race driver, and they both were. But in my 10 years of racing in Europe, I saw 30 of my friends and competitors killed. They were hard times. But it's not so much courage you need as absolute faith in yourself. And you also need luck. Fortunately, I had both." The next day I could hardly believe my eyes as past me, in the traffic down London's busy Chilwell Street, came a gleaming W196 Mercedes-Benz single-seater, driven by the silver-haired legend. As I ran after him, he stopped in the courtyard of the brewery, looked up and said, "Hello, Murray." Fangio remembered me. "Next time you're in Argentina," he said, "come to Balcarce and I'll show you my museum." At Buenos Aires, I was later to drive the very Mercedes-Benz in which he'd finished second in the legendary Mia Miglia, but by then Fangio had sadly died. I had, though, the honour of having been with my hero, who personalised for me a superb print of himself in his Grand Prix Mercedes. It hangs on my study wall to this day. I used to wonder what people get out of autographs, but not anymore. Fangio gave me some of his life. End of Side 3. Side 4. A year later I achieved another of my ambitions, to be in the same room as Enzo Ferrari. It would have been enough to be there. He didn't have to speak to me. Just be in the same room as this man who, to me, was the greatest in the history of motor racing. So you can imagine my joy when, in March 1988, the BBC said they'd arranged for me to go to Maranello to interview him. When I got there, I was introduced to Franco Gozzi, a long-time colleague of the Commendatore, who said to me, "3 historical questions. Mr. Ferrari likes historical questions." Not on your life, I thought. I haven't come all this way to ask him 3 historical questions. Signor Ferrari greeted me in his office, where he sat facing a portrait of his beloved son, Dino. On his desk was a black glass prancing horse given to him by Paul Newman. As ever, he was wearing dark glasses. Sitting nervously before him, I thought, he's 88, he's been interviewed hundreds of times in his own language, he's been asked every question I'm likely to think of countless times already, and here am I, an English foreigner, to ask them again. Somehow I've got to get his attention, or I'll be out before I realise I've arrived. "Signor Ferrari," I said, "you don't know me, but you knew my father. When you ran a motorcycle racing team in the 1930s, you used Rudge Whitworth bikes, and you bought them from my father, who was the Rudge sales director and who raced them very successfully, including here at Monza, where you met him and my mother." Now, not many people know that Ferrari had a motorcycle team in his early days, and I thought I saw a flicker of interest behind the dark glasses. "What was your father's name?" "Graham Walker." "And what is your name?" "Murray Walker, sir." "Yes, I bought them from Signor Barani, who was the Rudge distributor in Milan." I'd broken the ice. I have to admit that it wasn't the best interview I'd ever done, but I got him to talk, including his view that Nuvolari was the greatest of them all, and that two of the drivers who had impressed him most in his long and illustrious career were Englishmen, Peter Collins and Stirling Moss. Enzo Ferrari famously always used purple ink, and I was later sent a copy of his very limited edition autobiography, Le Mie Joie Terrible, My Terrible Joys. Written inside it in purple ink is, To Murray Walker, Enzo Ferrari. It isn't quite in a glass case, but it certainly occupies pride of place on my bookshelves as a cherished reminder of a very special day. Rushing round the world, appearing on the box, making personal appearances, giving after-dinner speeches, is a very satisfying way of life. I like people, enjoy performing, and am always immensely flattered when I'm recognised. And as a result of getting to be a bit famous, I had some wonderful experiences, one of which I was well and truly set up for. In 1997, I did a very successful video called Murray's Magic Moments. And when it was launched, Ivar Schlossberg, the boss of the production company, asked me to address the big trade buyers at the Sports Cafe in London. I was in full flow when I became aware of a subtle change in the atmosphere, and that the audience were looking to my left. I took a quick glance, and there was Michael Aspel. It didn't immediately register, and as everyone burst out laughing, I said, "What the hell are you doing here?" "Murray Walker," came the reply. "You thought you'd come here to talk about your video, but this is your life." Wow! If you're like me, you'd love to be the subject for what is one of the most watched and successful TV shows of all time. And I was really delighted. I said something stupid, I can't for the life of me remember what, and then started to go on with what I'd been saying. "Murray, we have to go," said Michael. "They're waiting for us." Now, to the extent that I'd thought about it, I'd always assumed there were several weeks' delay between the hit, as they call it, and the actual show, but that isn't the case. You go straight to the Shepperton studios where the programme's recorded in front of a live audience. "We've got a very special driver and limousine just up the road," said Michael, as we walked towards St James's Square. When we got to the car, the uniformed chauffeur got out to open the door for me. It was Damon Hill. After more flabbergasted reaction from me to camera, we drove to Shepperton, where I was shown to a dressing room and introduced to two of the programme staff. As transmission time got nearer, I decided I'd better spruce myself up. "I think I'd better have a shave," I said. "OK, Murray, we'll get you an electric razor." They showed no sign of leaving, so I had my shave and then said, "Better go to the loo. Where is it?" "It's just there, Murray, and we're not leaving, you know. We're the Suicide Squad." "What do you mean?" "Well, sometimes the subject panics and tries to do a bunk. We're here to see that you don't." No fear of that. I was really looking forward to it, and when it happened, it was great, a really moving experience. Elizabeth, who had done so much behind the scenes to make it happen, had been brought up from our Hampshire home. They'd somehow located Peter Johnson, my best wartime army friend. Jonathan Martin from the BBC was there with a lot of my chums from those happy days, including Max Robertson, with whom I'd done my very first broadcast in 1949. So were the ITV Formula One team and Eddie Jordan, Damon Hill, Johnny Herbert and Martin Brundle. My oldest friend, Brian Emerton, Peter Gwynn from my Macius years, and Stirling Moss, Nigel Mansell, Michael Schumacher, Chris Rea and Raymond Baxter had all recorded pieces. No less than 4 British touring car champions came on to remind me about the great times I'd had with them. But the thing that very nearly broke me up was when my 99-year-old mother appeared on the screen to say she was sorry she couldn't be with us, but that I'd been a good son and to have a great evening. At the end of a memorable and emotional evening, John Surtees rode in on the superb MV4 he'd raced to victory at the Isle of Man TT to say some very nice things. Then we all went to the green room for a wonderful party. It was certainly one of the very high points of my long TV career. With my advertising background and commentating, I was a natural for company presentations and really enjoyed doing them. Pirelli's Tom Northey phoned me one day and said, "We've got a sales conference coming up on the 7th of October, Murray. Can you host it for us?" "Yeah, sure, Tom. Where is it?" "The Mandarin Oriental Hotel, Singapore." It was for Pirelli's Asian distributors, and I was to do the links, introduce the speakers, and interview two of motorsport's greatest personalities, Sterling Moss and his Swedish brother-in-law, legendary rally driver Erik Karlsson, about their successes using Pirelli tyres. I got there early to get everything teed up, and when Sterling arrived a couple of days later, I said, "You're a snappy dresser, Sterling. There's an excellent Chinese tailor near the hotel who I've ordered some stuff from. Do you want to see him?" "Does he do shirts?" "Yes, he does." "With hidden buttons?" "Yes." "Double cuffs?" "Oh, yes." "Three-ply collars?" "God, I don't know how many plies there are, Sterling, but I'm sure he'll do what you want." "What does he charge?" £20. "Did you haggle with him?" "Well, no, I didn't, actually. I'm no good at it, and anyway, if he does hidden buttons, double cuffs and three-ply collars for £20, and makes a bob or two for himself, he's welcome as far as I'm concerned." "Wrong attitude, old boy. They like you to haggle. It's part of their culture. And if you don't, you make things a lot harder for people like me who do. Anyway, I've got an Indian chap in London who does them for £15, so thanks for asking, but no." I thought, Sterling's right. Why give it away if you don't have to? I was in the market for a new electric razor, so, totally against my nature, I went round Singapore haggling away until I got one I wanted for £52. When I got home and looked in the Argos catalogue, it was £48, so I haven't bothered since. I could only rank the stars of my time subjectively, but there's absolutely no doubt about who gave me the greatest entertainment value: Nigel Mansell. Like him or loathe him, there was always drama and excitement when Nigel was around. He mortgaged his house to buy a Formula 3 drive and discharged himself from hospital with a damaged spine to test drive for Lotus. He sat in a pool of petrol for the whole of his first Grand Prix, angrily took Senna by the throat in Belgium, and in Barcelona heart-stoppingly raced the great Brazilian wheel-to-wheel at over 200 miles an hour until he yielded. He won his first race for Ferrari in a car that no one, especially Ferrari, expected to last more than a few laps, made a fabulous passing move on Senna to win in Hungary, was black-flagged in Portugal, excluded in Spain, collapsed in the searing heat of Dallas while pushing his Lotus home, lost the 1986 World Championship with a burst tyre in Australia, and the 1987 Championship when he crashed in Japan during practice. He threw away the Canadian Grand Prix in his championship year by going too slowly on his last lap, impossibly passed Gerhard Berger at the notorious Peraltada corner in Mexico, had his wheel come off as he left the pit lane in Portugal, daringly double-bluffed teammate Nelson Piquet to win the 1987 British Grand Prix, was forever vociferously complaining about anything and everything, and mischievously rejoiced in fouling up my interviews. Red 5, as I used to call him in commentary after his car number, was magic. Do you detect a note of affection? Indeed you do. Nigel wasn't everybody's cup of tea, but he was mine. The man's determination and will to win was awe-inspiring. He was superb on the track, and we always got on well. In terms of Grand Prix victories and World Championship points, Nigel is the most successful British driver of all time. He was a tiger in the car, but in the eyes of many people, a king-size pain in the neck out of it. One of the top men with the Williams team once remarked that he wished Nigel was a human light bulb that he could plug into the car for the race and then put back on the shelf until the next one. He was only half joking. Thin-skinned and with a hair-trigger propensity to take offence, Nigel had to be handled with extreme care. "He's actually got a very well-adjusted personality," someone said to me once. "He's got a chip on both shoulders." It took him 72 races to win his first Grand Prix, and the Lotus team manager Peter Waugh, certainly not Nigel's #1 fan, made a famous comment he was later to rue. "Nigel Mansell will never win a Grand Prix as long as he's got a hole in his arse." He won 31, exceeded only by Michael Schumacher, Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna. Was world champion in 1992, and only Schumacher's won as many races, 9, as Mansell in a single season. There's no denying he's difficult, but he delivered excitement, drama and pleasure which outweighed many times whatever irritation and dislike he generated. Despite his success, he was not the luckiest of drivers, but he went on to win the American Champ Car Championship in his rookie year in 1993 and to return triumphantly to Formula One in 1994 to win his final Grand Prix before retiring. He gave me and all his countless fans an enormous amount of pleasure, and I'll not forget him. I've said I'm not going to try to rank the top Formula One drivers I've seen, but nevertheless I've said that in my belief the very best of them was Juan Manuel Fangio. I can't prove it, I just believe it. Or at least I did, because now I'm not so sure. It could be Michael Schumacher. Better than Senna, Prost, Jim Clark and the rest of the superstars? Yes, I think so, but Michael's a long way from being everybody's #1, especially in Britain. "Tell me what that arrogant bastard Schumacher's really like," someone once said to me. "Hey, just a minute," I replied. "Have you met him? Why do you say he's arrogant?" "Oh, you've only got to look at him, haven't you? And he's German." "Well, hang on. Your prejudice is showing. You're wrong. He's a really decent bloke. He's never been anything other than helpful and considerate to me, and I've got a lot of time for him. He's as friendly as you can expect anybody in his position to be. In fact, he's an amazingly normal bloke if you know him. Loves his wife, children and football. All you see of him on the box is when he's under colossal pressure with the whole of Italy and Ferrari depending on him, and with everyone wanting a piece of his life. Can I have my photograph taken with you, Michael? Can I interview you, Michael? Will you do something for my charity, Michael? Can I have your autograph, Michael? You have to meet the sponsor, Michael." But he's there to win races, and with the competition he's got to focus on that totally. Nobody's going to give him any medals, let alone the money he's paid, if he takes his eye off the ball for an instant. I don't think I convinced him, but that's what I feel. So what is he really like? Well, he's similar to Ayrton Senna in some ways, but totally different in others. He's not charismatic like the Brazilian, but serious, matter-of-fact and straightforward, although just as thorough and businesslike. Ask him a question, and you get a carefully considered answer. Like Senna, he's the complete master of every aspect of his craft, physical and mental, from keeping super fit and knowing everything there is to know about his car, to building the whole team around him, to nurture and support him and do everything his way. It's always tough for his teammate, because no matter what the contract says, Schumacher is absolute #1. Like Senna, he's ruthless on the track, and because of his determination to win, he's been involved in more brutally controversial moves than most. Take Adelaide 1994, where he took out Damon Hill to win the World Championship. Jerez 1997, where he rammed Jacques Villeneuve, this time to lose the championship and be rightly excluded from its final classification as a penalty. And regularly chopping across the track from pole position at the start to block his rivals. Legal but unfair, the experts say. "Are we racing or playing children's games?" retorts Michael. Personally, I strongly disagree with it being allowed, as I think it's both dangerous and unsportsmanlike. But rules are rules, and what Schumacher consistently does is not against them. Tough and ruthless he may be, but cold and heartless he most certainly is not. Witness his open love for his family, his unbridled leaps for joy on the podium, his tearful breakdown at Monza 2000 after he'd matched Airton Senna's 41 Grand Prix wins, his abject misery at Monza 2001 just 5 days after the devastating terrorist attacks of September the 11th, and his ability to relax, let his hair down, and party all night with the best of them at Suzuka's end-of-season celebrations. But above all, Michael is a racer, with so many stunning victories to his name. Belgium 1995, where from 16th on the grid he brilliantly outdrove Damon Hill, using slick tyres on a rain-soaked track to win, albeit with some extremely robust wheel-banging tactics which earned him as much criticism as praise. Spain 1996, his first win for Ferrari, where he ran rings round everyone in the wet. Monaco 1997, where the same thing happened. Hungary 1998, where an inspired race strategy from technical director Ross Brawn required Schumacher to gain 19 seconds in 25 laps to permit a third race-winning pit stop, and he did it. Shades of Fangio at the Nürburgring 1957. Malaysia 1999, where after a 6-race layoff, recovering from a broken leg, he pulverised the opposition and then selflessly moved over to let teammate Eddie Irvine through to win. Japan 2000, where he became Ferrari's first world champion since Jody Scheckter in 1979. Michael had already contributed to my This Is Your Life programme with some kind words. He'd led the drivers who gave me a signed magnum of champagne at Silverstone to commemorate my last British Grand Prix for the BBC. And we'd sat together at the wonderful Grand Prix ball at Melbourne, where I was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award. But his presence at the surprise party the teams threw for me at Indianapolis 2001, my last Grand Prix, touched me deeply. Tony Jardine, a great showman, masterminded it, and he was getting the many drivers who were there to take a card with the words of one of my bloopers on it and imitate me delivering it. He called Michael up to say, in my way, "And here's Michael Schumacher, son of Ralph Schumacher. Now the boot is on the other Schumacher." I stoutly contest that I ever said it, mind you, but that's another story. Michael was mystified. What do I have to do? Say it like Murray did. But I wasn't there, I was in the race. "Here, Michael," I said, "let's do it together." I put my arm round his shoulders and we did a duet which brought the house down. I was touched and delighted that he came at all. Even more so by the fact that on the eve of the race he stayed for the whole hour and a half. Never mind being mightily impressed at his being prepared to have a go at the Murrayism. "Were you happy with what Tony did, Murray?" he asked afterwards. "Yes, Michael, I was delighted. Why?" "I thought he lacked respect." No, that was just a bit of fun." "Oh, was that your English sense of humour?" "Well, yes, I suppose it was." "Oh, I see." I don't think he did, because to him it must have seemed a very strange way of honouring someone. Afterwards, he said he'd like to be interviewed by me following the race. And from a bloke who just doesn't give interviews at the track, I regarded that as a true honour. It was the last interview I did, and one of my best. With one of the very best, if not the best. I've had a lot of fun with Bernie Ecclestone too. Bernie's image is of a hard, ruthless, immensely wealthy and enormously powerful business tycoon. And you certainly don't get to where he is without being an awesomely competent and adventurous entrepreneur who takes no prisoners. "I do deals," says Bernie. Deals which started in his childhood and progressed through a motorcycle business into cars, property and Formula One. He was a racer himself, from 500cc single-seaters up to Grand Prix standard, before he decided he was better at managing than driving, and looked after two of Grand Prix racing's greatest naturals. Stuart Lewis Evans, who was tragically killed before he could realise his full potential with Vanwall, and Jochen Rindt, Formula One's only posthumous world champion. Bernie then bought Brabham, and made a double world champion out of Nelson Piquet in 1981 and 1983. The world knows him now as the unchallenged boss of Formula One. Nothing happens without Bernie approving, and through his audacious wheeling and dealing, he's made himself an immensely wealthy man. In the process, he's made Formula One what it is today, a worldwide sport that nations vie with each other to host. Of course, he's as tough and demanding, hard and determined as you'd expect him to be. But he's also razor-sharp, incredibly quick-witted, and when people least expect it, extremely kind and thoughtful. His standards of presentation are obsessively high, and years ago, when I asked him if I could go to his Brabham premises at Chessington to interview his gifted and talented designer Gordon Murray, he said, No, I don't want your lot dragging their cameras along the walls." But he relented when I gave him my personal guarantee that we'd all respect his building. Gordon sat in a corner of the design office with windows to the left and behind him, and when the cameraman went to adjust the blinds that control the natural light, he said, "They don't move." "Yes, they do," said the cameraman. "You just pull this chain here." Which he did, only to find that indeed they didn't move. Mr. Ecclestone didn't like the angle we had them at, so they've been bolted up solid, said Gordon. Then there's the other side to Bernie. In 1988, BBC Grand Prix celebrated its 10th anniversary at the Monaco Grand Prix, so we took a special cake with us and arranged for all the team bosses, Ron Dennis, Frank Williams, Ken Tyrrell, Jackie Oliver and co., to form a semicircle round me while I did my bit to camera. "OK, gentlemen," I said, "when I've done my words, I'm going to cut the cake, and I want you all to shout out together, 'Happy Birthday Grand Prix.' Got it? Good, let's do it." As I got ready to do a take, I noticed Bernie quietly going down the line speaking to the talent. I should have known. When I finished my lines to camera and started cutting the cake, they all shouted as one, "Bollocks!" Bernie masterminds everything at Grand Prix, from a sinister, grey, custom-built coach, commonly known as the Kremlin, from which he can see you without you seeing him. I was looking for him one day and got in to find it full of compartments which were seemingly empty. "Anybody here?" I shouted. "It depends who wants to know," came Bernie's voice from the back. About 10 years ago, I was walking round the circuit at Monaco on the Wednesday before the race to see whether there'd been any changes, when a Fiat with smoked windows drew up alongside me. The back window went down a few inches, a pair of heavy, black, horn-rimmed glasses looked out at me, and I was offered a lift. "Thanks, Bernie," I said. "Where are you going?" "Only to the paddock." When we arrived, Bernie took a wad of tissue paper out of his pocket and said, "I was passing a jeweller's in Bond Street the other day and saw this. I thought you might like it." I unwrapped it, and there was a gold lapel pin reproduction of the old 8-sided BBC table microphone. I was poleaxed, and as I spluttered out my thanks, he said, "Well, you are the BBC, aren't you?" Undeserved praise, but I was and am immensely grateful. At the first Australian Grand Prix in 1985, a man came up to me in the paddock at Adelaide, holding something in his hand. "Hi, Murray. Me and my mates are big fans of yours. We've had this made, and if you don't mind, we're all going to wear one in the grandstand on Sunday." "Oh, right," I said. "What is it?" "It's a T-shirt," he said, opening it up to reveal a big cartoon drawing of myself with the words Murray Walker Fan Club. "Oh, thank you," I said. "I think it's terrific. I'm very flattered." "Great, Murray. Glad you like it. Now I'll show you the back." In big letters it said, "Unless I'm very much mistaken." Yes, I am very much mistaken. I thought it was great. Murrayisms, they're called. Verbal bloopers coming out in my enthusiasm for what was happening before my very eyes. They didn't worry me unduly. Sports commentating should involve enthusiasm, spontaneity and a bit of fun, or at least I think so. Formula One's a fast-moving sport that calls for passionate and engaging description, so get your foot down and give it all you've got. I was told time after time that I should engage brain before operating mouth, but I was often too fired up for that to happen. What I said came from the heart. We all make mistakes. My problem was that mine were immediately transmitted to millions of people all over the world. In the never-ending heat of the action, I either didn't realise what I'd said, or if I did, couldn't correct it because things had moved on. I used to shrug it all off by saying, I don't make mistakes, I make prophecies which immediately turn out to be wrong. With the benefit of hindsight, plus years of experience of opening my mouth and putting my foot in it, I've carefully analysed my problem areas, which I feel can be categorised like this. 1. Well, there's a surprise. 2. Maybe I should rephrase that. 3. If you see what I mean. 4. Appearances can be deceptive. And 5. I really do not believe I actually said that. So let's review them. Well, there's a surprise. I think this is the biggest category of all. The ones which, looked at afterwards, state the blindingly obvious as though it was a brilliantly perceptive flash of inspiration. I could explain a lot of them, which might make them seem more sensible than they sound, but don't ask me in cold blood why on earth I said them. They just came out. Try these for size. And now, Lafitte is as close to Sura as Sura is to Lafitte. There's nothing wrong with the car except it's on fire. With half the race gone, there's half the race still to go. I imagine the conditions in those cars are totally unimaginable. Tournbay's hopes, which were previously nil, are now absolutely zero. Either that car is stationary or it's on the move. There's no doubt in my mind that if the race had lasted for 46 laps instead of 45, it would have been a McLaren first and second, but it didn't, so it wasn't. You can't see the digital clock on your monitors because there isn't one. Keith Rip's in trouble, real trouble. And that was a masterpiece of understatement. Keith's Rallycross Mini was rolling end over end at Lyddon, disintegrating as it did so. It's raining and the track is wet. We're now on the 73rd lap and the next one will be the 74th. This is an interesting circuit because it has inclines, and not just up, but down as well. The gap between the cars is 0.9 seconds. That's less than a second. He's in front of everyone in this race except for the two in front of him. Into lap 53, the penultimate last lap but one. He's obviously gone in for a wheel change. I say obviously because I can't see it. Then there's the second. Maybe I should rephrase that. Do my eyes deceive me, or is Senna's car sounding a bit rough? I can't imagine what kind of a problem Senna has. I imagine it must be some sort of a grip problem. Speaking from memory, I don't know how many points Piquet's got. Alain Prost is in a commanding second place. I was talking about the championship rather than the race at the time. What a fabulous race! Barry Sheen's riding his Suzuki as though he's married to it. Only 10 of the drivers who started this race are left. I make no apologies for their absence. I'm sorry they're not here. Prost can see Mansell in his earphones. I've just stopped my stopwatch. And we've had 5 races so far this year: Brazil, Argentina, Imola, Schumacher and Monaco. Third category, if you see what I mean. A mediocre season for Nelson Piquet, as he's now known and always has been. I should explain that Piquet's full name is Nelson Piquet Sotomayor, When he started racing, he dropped his surname in an effort to stop his parents knowing. It didn't work, but he stayed Nelson Piquet. The first 4 cars are both on the same tyres. And the first 5 places are filled by 5 different cars. By which I meant 5 different constructors. That was exactly the same place where Senna overtook Nannini that he didn't overtake Prost. I knew what I meant, but did they? As you look at the first 4, the significant thing is that Alboreto is 5th, because that meant he was earning 2 championship points. And this is the 3rd place car about to lap the 2nd place car. Don't ask. Here's Giacomelli, driving like the veteran he is not. The battle is well and truly on if it wasn't on before, and it certainly was. 2 laps to go, then the action will begin, unless this is the action, which it is. 4th category, appearances can be deceptive. And it's Mansell! Nigel Mansell! It was Alain Prost in an identical Ferrari. Murray. There's a fiery glow coming from the back of the Ferrari. James Hunt. No, Murray, that's his rear safety light. Damon Hill is coming into the pit lane. Yes, it's Damon Hill coming into the Williams pit, and Damon Hill is in the pit. No, it's Schumacher. Murray. Bernie, it's some 17 years since you bought McLaren. You've had some good times and bad times. What do you remember best? Bernie Ecclestone. I don't remember buying McLaren. It was Brabham, actually. Pete Dam wins as he looks through a completely clear windscreen, which is, of course, the advantage of being in front. As I said this, he drove straight into a grass bank. Let's watch this typical Formula Ford start. It was anything but. They all drove into each other. It is clear at this stage of the race that Nigel Mansell is not going to make a pit stop. And of course he did. Here comes the gallant little Frenchman Alain Prost, almost home for his 6th Grand Prix win. Nothing can stop him now. He hit a wet patch, spun into the barrier, lost a wheel and retired. 5th category. I really do not believe I said that. It's a sad ending, albeit a happy one, here at Montreal for today's Grand Prix. The young Ralf Schumacher has been upstaged by teenager Jenson Button, who's 20. Andrea de Cesaris, the man who's won more Grand Prix than anyone else without actually winning one. I think I meant to say competed in more Grand Prix. Now, taken out of context, they sound pretty weird. A lot of them sound pretty weird in context. But on the other hand, there were things I said that made me quite pleased with myself for plucking them out of thin air in the heat of the moment. These are the ones I like the best. Unless I'm very much mistaken. Go, go, go! Spin, spin, spin! Fire, fire, fire! Good things obviously come in threes. The atmosphere is so tense you could cut it with a cricket stump. And now the boot is on the other Schumacher. Anything can happen in Formula One, and it usually does. If Mika Häkkinen's going to do well, he needs to put his great big woolly Finnish socks up. If. That's F1 spelt backwards. There's only 1 second between them. 1. That's how long a second is. And now excuse me while I interrupt myself. He's shedding buckets of adrenaline in that car. And now I've got to stop because I've got a lump in my throat. That was when Damon Hill crossed the line at Suzuka in 1996 to win the race and the World Championship. My swan song year, 2001, was one of enormous emotion, capping an unforgettable career of mainly colossal highs in Formula One. In telling you about the recognition I was lucky enough to achieve, I hope I don't come across as vain or boastful. It's just that I'm enormously proud of what happened to me, and I'd like you to know about it. It was in 1996, my last year with the BBC, when, on the 12th of December, I received the OBE from Her Majesty the Queen. I'd been told of the award, for services to broadcasting and motorsport, 7 months earlier in a letter from the Prime Minister's office, which notified me, in strict confidence, that my name was to be submitted to the Queen with a recommendation that I be appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire, and would I assure them that this would be agreeable. Agreeable? As a flag-waving patriot, fiercely proud of his great country and its monarchy, I couldn't get to the writing paper fast enough. On Investiture Day, I drove into the inner courtyard of Buckingham Palace with Elizabeth and walked, awestruck, past the lifeguards in full ceremonial dress and into the gallery, where I was briefed with the rest of the recipients on when and where to walk and what to say by one of Her Majesty's colonels. If Her Majesty continues to talk to you after congratulating you, you first address her as Your Majesty. Thereafter, you address her as ma'am, as in jam, not ma'am, as in jam. And after she's shaken your hand, you get on your bike. All clear? Later, as Her Majesty hung the medal on my lapel, she said, "I seem to have been listening to you for a very long time." "I'm delighted to hear that, Your Majesty." "How long have you been commentating now?" 48 years, ma'am, as in jam. That is a long time. To me, being honoured by your country for doing something that gave you so much happiness and satisfaction was the ultimate achievement I could have hoped for. 2001, the year I decided was going to be my last as a commentator, hurtled by in a cloud of euphoria amid emotional occasion after emotional occasion. So much so that it was difficult to do my job at times and not get caught up in the Murray's last year atmosphere. It wasn't easy, because almost everywhere I went there were major ego-boosting farewell events, starting at the first race of the year in Melbourne to the United States Grand Prix at the fabled Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Things could not have been worse. America was grief-stricken and traumatised, for the United States Grand Prix was to be held on the 30th of September, just 19 days after the mind-numbing terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. There was serious talk of cancelling the race, but America rallied, took a deep breath, showed two fingers to terrorism and turned up. On race day, over 200,000 people poured through the gates of the vast stadium, nearly twice as many as at any other Grand Prix. It was an unforgettable day. There was an outpouring of passion, defiance and national pride, the like of which I'd never seen anywhere. And it was a great race, with victory going to Mika Hakkinen in a return to championship-winning form. For me, of course, Indianapolis was an emotional cauldron, because it was to be my last ever Grand Prix commentary, over half a century after my first. Everything went normally until the Friday evening, but I suspected something was afoot, especially after ITV's Paul Tyrrell said, "I know you know something's up, Murray. Let's go and find out what it is." Off we went to the Williams Pavilion in the Paddock Club, and when I walked in, I was flabbergasted. At a time when I would have expected everyone to be working like mad, getting their cars ready for the next day's vital qualifying session, there were some 300 people sitting at tables drinking champagne. Drivers, team principals, sponsors, engineers, mechanics, media people, and I knew all of them. They'd even been into the city to collect Elizabeth. Tony Jardine was at a lectern in front of a cinema screen, and Michael Schumacher was sitting at the side. So I went and joined him. And then Tony took off with a brilliantly funny and endearing review of my life and times, illustrated by film clips of my most famous gaffes. Bernie Ecclestone was there, Flavio Briatore, Ross Brawn and Paul Stoddart. And so were David Coulthard, Eddie Irvine, Jenson Button, Rubens Barrichello, and so many other Formula One notables that I'd known for years. One by one, Tony got them up to say some very pleasant things about my contribution to their world. But the best by far, and the funniest, was when he cajoled them into imitating my Murrayisms. Then Bernie himself stepped up to say some wonderful things, including the fact that I'd be getting one of the rare and incredibly privileged red passes normally only given to past world champions. Next, Tony George, the boss at Indianapolis, appeared at the lectern. Now, this was unbelievable for me. Tony is an action man of very few words. Compared with him, the uncommunicative Mika Hakkinen is a charismatic chatterbox. "Murray," he said, reaching down into a box at his feet, "we normally give one of these to the Indy 500 winner, and that's about it. But this one is yours." It was one of the bricks which had formed the original 1909 surface of Indianapolis, to give it its name, the Brickyard. Varnished and beautifully mounted on a wooden base with an inscribed plaque, carrying under the famous IMS winged symbol the words, "The Indianapolis Motor Speedway salutes Murray Walker, the voice of Formula One. September 2001. I was overwhelmed, but now it was time for me to say something. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you all being here. You're all my friends, and I've loved every second of working with you, because ours is a wonderful sport and you are a marvellous lot. This is an incredible and genuinely unexpected occasion for me, and Sunday's going to be very tough and emotional, because it's going to be the last time I'll see you all doing what I love so much. But I'll be giving it my best shot. For now, though, we've all got jobs to do, and I really appreciate you interrupting yours to be here. So off you go, with my heartfelt thanks for your company. Believe me, I'll remember this forever. Sunday's race and its unforgettable atmosphere made the whole thing more than worthwhile, and that night we flew out of Indianapolis with British Airways. My commentating life was over. So many splendid memories. I've been a very lucky man, lucky enough to have filled my life with my passions, motorsport and broadcasting. Activities that were challenging, absorbing and rewarding. As a result, my life has been full of variety and satisfaction. Retiring altogether is something I've never wanted to do. Quite apart from loving what I do, I've seen too many men die not long after they stopped working, simply because they had nothing to occupy them and exercise their brains. At nearly 80, I'm enjoying every second of still being able to work, and hope to be able to go on doing so for some time yet. I've stopped commentating, but now fill the time with lots of other things like writing, working for ITV as a pundit, appearing in videos, attending corporate functions and making after-dinner speeches and commercials. I want to stay sharp, not vegetate, and I firmly believe that the way to do so is to be in competition with younger people. Elizabeth and I have a very nice home in the New Forest with open country surroundings, a trout river, and our own woodlands inhabited by deer, foxes, countless squirrels and a regiment of rabbits. It's a very nice place to live, and I enjoy being there amid the peace and quiet. Now, I've seen more of the world than most, so holidays have to be special to get us out of the house. We found the ideal to be cruises, and we've both become enthusiasts. We got the bug when Cunard invited me to do a series of talks on their magnificent QE2, for which I recruited some of my motorsport mates to form a panel. Formula One journalists Alan Henry and Nigel Roebuck, McLaren's Joe Ramirez, and sports car star John Fitzpatrick, who was also secretary of the British Racing Drivers Club. It was a great success, and I subsequently did similar trips on the fine P&O ships Victoria, Arcadia and Oriana, whilst Elizabeth and I also took journeys together. It's a great way to take a holiday. A 5-star floating hotel with unique benefits. No constant packing and unpacking, every facility you could possibly want, from health centres and restaurants to clay pigeon shooting, shops, library, stage shows and cinemas, plus the interesting places you can visit. We've gone on cruises in the Caribbean, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and to New York, and I never tire of them. I hope to do a lot more now that I have some free time on my hands, but there are so many other things to take in as well. I love Australia and want to explore the whole country. New Zealand too, because I've yet to go there, and I've still to see the Antarctic and the Norwegian fjords. The motor museums of the world beckon me, especially those in America, Fangio's place at Balcarce, and the Schlumpf collection in Alsace-Lorraine. The Targa Tasmania Rally is something I'd love to compete in, and now I'll be able to go back to the Isle of Man and catch up with what's been happening at the TT since I was last there. So much to see and do. But of one thing I'm sure. Motorsport hasn't seen the last of me, and hopefully neither has broadcasting. They both mean too much to me. ITV are still using me in an elder statesman role in their Formula One coverage, and if they continue to do so, it'd be a marvellous way for me to maintain contact with the sport I love. Old soldiers never die, they only fade away, and I want to do so with dignity, keeping the light burning brightly until my time comes. I'm told there is a life after Formula One, and I intend to prove it, with races still to see, jobs yet to be done, new friends to make, reminiscences to be shared, and places yet to visit. It's a great life if you don't weaken, and I hope not to do that for a while. I'll be mindful of those words of my mother. Always remember, dear, when one door closes, another opens. And I look forward to walking through it.